I'm calling to order public meeting number 66 on May 3rd, 2013. We are now operating in 3 different locations. Commissioner Stebbins, do you want to check in, Commissioner Stebbins?
I'm here in Marlborough, Massachusetts.
Okay. And Commissioner McHugh?
I'm here at Bristol Community College in Fall River.
Great. As we've done on the other time we had a public hearing on regs, we've tried to make it as convenient as possible by having multiple sites. Whether it turns out to be worth the trouble, we'll think about. But when it works, it's pretty remarkable. And our viewers on the web will also be able to see all 3 sites, see and hear all 3 sites, as far as we know. A couple of things just about the process. This is our regular, what has been weekly meetings, going to turn to bi-weekly meetings, and we're going to conduct a bunch of regular business, but our first item on the agenda will be the hearing on our regs, on the Phase 2 regs. And we'll have that scheduled for at least an hour, from 9 until 10. We'll take public comments. We will not be talking about the feedback we've got. We've got a lot of comments in writing. We have some comments to be delivered orally. We will be reviewing those, reading those, assessing those, contrasting them all one to another, and then we'll have another public meeting within a couple of weeks where we will talk about each one of the comments that came from the various contributors. So we won't be actually iterating back and forth on the comments today. If we have votes, we'll have them by roll call. And I think we will limit our speakers to about 10 minutes. I don't think we have very many, so we're not going to run out of time, but for reasons of not putting everybody to sleep, we'll keep everybody to about 10 minutes. Commissioner Stebbins, do we have any speakers in Marlborough?
No, we don't. We have 2 guests, but neither of the 2 have planned to speak. Is that correct?
Okay. Commissioner McHugh?
I have no speakers here. I have Professor Robillard from the community college here who teaches a courses in casinos, but he does not wish to speak either.
Okay. We have 2 speakers in Boston. Kevin Conroy from Foley Hoag representing Mohegan Sun, and Catherine Rollins from the Mass Municipal Association. We will start with Attorney Conroy.
Good morning, Commissioners. Commissioner McHugh and Stevenson, happy birthday, Chairman.
Thank you.
We, Mohegan Sun, represent Mohegan Sun. They submitted a detailed 9-page document with your comments, our comments on the RFA2 regs. We're not going to repeat those in detail today. They did ask me, however, to go through a couple of comments that they had because they wanted to sort of emphasize those for the Commission. Our comments are based on our experiences in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, as well as New Jersey, and is also closely following the evolution of the Gaming Act. We've been here in Massachusetts for the last 5 years. We've had our site in Palmer, and we've closely followed this process. First, we did not comment on the 3 questions in our that you asked us to comment, or that you put out for question last week, and I wanted to quickly address those. We do support the change, all the changes that you proposed last week. We support allowing surrounding communities access to the disbursement funds on the timeline you suggested. In addition to that, we do support and are happy to submit or send copies of all of our studies that we submit with the RFA2 application to the surrounding communities when we do submit our RFA2 application. A couple notes about the surrounding communities. We are fully committed to participating in the regional planning authority process that you put together, and we're working very closely with the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission as well as Ombudsman Ziemba on that process. We think that process is going to be very helpful in facilitating this. We've already had an initial meeting with Mr. Brennan and Ombudsman Ziemba. We hope and expect that process will lead us to, and lead the potential surrounding communities around Palmer to not have to resort to using involuntary disbursements. We think that process should prevent that, and we're fully committed to it.
Great.
We also support the change in the RFA2 deadline, moving that up to early December. Like many of the applicants, we plan to enter into our surrounding community agreement our host community agreement in June. We plan to have a referendum in September. The timeline you propose will not interfere with what we're trying to accomplish. We think we will have more than enough time to negotiate our surrounding community agreements by that early December due date that you've put together. One thing we do urge is that the commission just set that RFA2 due date. I think we and most of the applicants right now are working on a timeline that sort of stops with that due date. And to the extent we can get some certainty from the commission as to when that due date is, it'll set the rest of our timeline in motion. That's a very
You're talking about the application date?
the application. That is in our mind the most important date. Once you establish that date, we can work our timelines around it. But as you know, and you've really come to appreciate and you're recognizing, there's a lot that is going on in Palmer and with the rest of the applicants on this, and all of that is dictated by that RFA2 due date. And so we urge you to set that due date. But we appreciate that early December is a timeline that we can work well within. Thank you. Sorry. Just a couple of notes about the RFA2 regulations. First, the Section 118 talks about the commission having the authority to negotiate with applicants regarding the content of their applications. Talks about the commission potentially suggesting to applicants that they amend their applications. These are the RFA2 applications, as well as requesting best and final offers from applicants after the applications have been submitted. We appreciate that these regs, I think, are a little bit ahead of the commission's discussion on how you're going to evaluate the RFA2 applications. I think you've only really had one meeting where you sort of started exploring exactly how you're going to what is going to happen after the RFA2 applications have been submitted. We do suggest in our comments some caution about this, about some of these processes. We are concerned that if you do a best and final offer round, that one, you're going to discourage applicants from putting their best foot forward. They may hold something back in their applications, knowing that the commission's going to come back to them and asking for more. We are concerned about issues of favoritism. We wonder how you can put together a best and final offer process or a negotiation process, how you're going to be able to do that transparently, how you're going to be able to sort of not show favoritism to one applicant. The regulations talk about the staff doing this, wondering if that's going to be done in open sessions or if that's going to be done behind closed doors, and we are concerned about the commission doing that behind closed doors. We're concerned about the delay that could come from best and final offers and a whole nother round of bidding, if you will, that comes with that. And we're also concerned about how you're going to standardize that. As the commission says, you've got an 11-page spreadsheet right now of 11 different pages of evaluation criteria. And we're wondering how you're going to fit the 11 pages of criteria into putting together a best and final offer. We also wanted to acknowledge that the legislature talked about, prior to in initial versions of the Gaming Act, talked about doing an auction process. They talked about best and final offers, and they went away from that entirely, and they came to the system that we have today. The Act doesn't talk about best and final offers, and I don't want to get in a protracted conversation with Commissioner McHugh about whether it's allowed or not, but it certainly is not the legislative intent that there be best and final offers. It's certainly not in the Act, and so. We have a number of areas of concern that relate to that those provisions in the Act. Finally, I wanted to talk again about confidentiality. I know this has been an issue that has run throughout sort of the Commission's discussion. Has been a consistent theme for the last 6 months. The Commission has very appropriately told applicants, hey, we're living with the Act, and the Act requires that certain materials that we provide, applicants provide to the Commission are necessarily public, and that Act is unique. compared to acts across the Commonwealth. And the Commission has appropriately
Across the country.
Across the country, excuse me. We really appreciated the specimen applications that you used in RFA 1. We thought that was a good way to provide guidance to applicants as to what was going to be confidential and what was not. We urge that process again for the RFA 2 applications. I think there's a feeling out there that most of what is in the RFA 2 applications is going to be public. However, we do note that there are certain areas that should not be public. For example, the internal security information that Mohegan Sun has, they would prefer not making that public as part of their application. You currently, right now, your regs talk about needing additional personal checking information or personal banking information related to qualifiers. That's in your RFA 2 regs as an area. Again, we're gonna urge you to keep that information confidential. So we do urge you that we're gonna need to go through a specimen application process again for the RFA 2 applications. Kind of coming back a little bit to RFA 1, one of our frustrations with the RFA 1 process is we understand what is confidential in our applications. However, since that time, we have been asked by the Commission, as all the applicants have had, to provide numerous documents about our individual qualifiers. For example, we've been provided personal banking information about our qualifiers. We provide personal real estate records about our qualifiers. And when we have submitted those materials, we have told the Commission that we think they are confidential, and we have followed the Commission's regulations. However, we never have gotten assurances from the Commission that this information will be kept confidential. We write these letters to the Commission when we submit this information saying, hey, this information is confidential, here's why, consistent with the regulations. However, the Commission never gets back to us and says, yes, we will keep this confidential. And that has kind of raised some anxiety among qualifiers, and as they ask us, the entity, are you going to be able to keep this information confidential? And I think, it seems like you're going to need to go through another RFA 1 process with Region C. I would urge the Commission, and we urge in our comments, the Commission think about sort of some blanket areas similar to the specimen applications where they would deem information confidential, blanket confidentiality to begin with. For example, you could indicate in your regulations that if a qualifier needs to submit personal banking information, that information would be deemed confidential. It would lower anxiety throughout, I think, the qualifier, the application community. It would fit squarely with the Act and what you do.
Could you explain a little bit? I don't quite understand. If we did, so are you saying just sort of set out a list of
Yes.
items that would be?
Yes, and I think I think you could work with there is a really standard request now that the IAB has given to all applicants. It's about 25 questions where they've asked for specific information from the qualifiers. It's not directly part of the application. It's been the second step in the RFA 1 process where they've asked each of our qualifiers to supply, and it's a list of 25 different areas of documents. And we've all tried to do that. When we've submitted that information, Chairman, however, there's been no blanket confidentiality that has applied to that material. And similar to the way you did the specimen applications, we would urge you to adopt some way so that we could provide some certainty to our qualifiers, hey, this information will be kept confidential.
Okay, that will, as you said, that relates not just to the regs that are going on, but to ongoing discussions, and we will be talking about that a little bit later on today, too.
Great.
Because that's an interesting point.
Thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Thank you, Attorney Conroy. Did everybody hear all right in the distant sites, Marlborough and Fall River?
Yes, I heard fine.
Okay, great. I just want to write a quick note here. Okay, our second speaker is Catherine Rollins from the Mass Municipal Association. Please join us. Welcome.
Thank you. And good morning, Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Commissioners.
Good
Thank
morning.
you for
giving us the opportunity to be here and to comment very briefly, and I will in fact keep it to a couple of minutes. We appreciate the opportunity to submit input, and we have submitted extensive comments electronically, so I will not go over them except to highlight a couple of key points. If I had to...
Steve, I'm having a problem hearing her.
Okay.
Now I am too.
Rob, any, so can you hear me, Commissioner McHugh? Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
And Commissioner Stebbins, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so, but you can't hear our speaker. Kathy,
Is
why-
this better?
If she could just speak up or pull the mic a little closer.
okay.
Okay. As I was saying, we appreciate the opportunity to offer input. We have submitted detailed comments towards the creation of the strongest possible policy framework for municipalities in the final regulations. Our key point here today is that we hope that you will give significant and serious weight to any input that you receive from prospective host and surrounding communities. As you very well know, casino development and slots parlors are completely new to Massachusetts, and they will have very significant and long-lasting impacts in our cities and towns. The folks in our city halls and our town halls across the Commonwealth who may either host a casino or slots parlor or be in the region of a casino or slots parlor will need to invest significant municipal expertise, resources, and time to this process. While they have never dealt with the casino development process before, they often have dealt with very large and novel economic development processes, so they know best what they need in terms of appropriate timelines, what makes sense for them, how they go about their local permitting processes, and how to work with the state to most effectively bring about these very valuable projects. So I do know that you will have received or will receive in the future comments from folks in these positions, and we certainly would give significant consideration to what they are requesting. The rest of our comments, and we do go into a
Is
bit
that,
of-
just make sure that I got the point. The point of that was simply that we should pay, you're urging us to pay attention to what the various communities suggest in their feedback? Is that the point?
Exactly, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, that is the point.
All right.
We do offer comments.
I think we can accept that one.
But we certainly want to give deference
Okay.
to the local officials who are in these towns that are most directly affected.
Okay.
And we do appreciate the level of engagement that all of the commissioners and Ombudsman Ziemba have had to this point. Everyone has been very accessible, and it's been a very transparent and methodical process, so we do appreciate that. The bulk of our comments, beyond urging you to really take the local perspective into account, offer sort of tweaks to a lot of different language that was contained in the drafts around issues pertaining to host communities, the election process, criteria around surrounding communities, and the reopening of mitigation agreements. I won't go into them unless you want to discuss any of those things specifically, but we do hope that you take into consideration some of these comments and suggestions in the final regulations.
I would actually be interested in having you expand on the issue about considering positives as well as negatives, which is one of the issues you addressed.
Sure.
What's your thought process on that?
From our perspective, if there is a negative impact in a community, we don't feel that it's really possible or advisable to try to quantify the projected positive impacts that might result. The examples we use, you can't really say that, folks might obtain X many jobs from a surrounding community, so therefore that might outweigh any negative traffic impacts that occur in that surrounding community. They're very different in terms of, potential positive impacts, potential negative impacts. I think the negative impacts are much easier to quantify and project, and we don't feel that it's something that should be a zero-sum analysis here. So we would just ask that you consider the negative impacts. when you are looking to make those determinations if it comes to you for that decision.
Okay. Anything else? What's your position with MMA, Ms.
I'm a
Rollins?
legislative analyst for economic development and energy issues.
Okay. Any questions from afar, from anybody?
No, that was very helpful, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ms. Rollins. Okay. Any other people to speak that didn't sign up? All right, I think we will, yeah. Did you sign up? Oh, all right, come right up. We'll be flexible. All right.
Hi, my name is Sean Sullivan. I'm from Charlestown, Massachusetts. And congratulations to the commission. You're almost a year in existence. I know it was hard to stand up the agency. You've had a lot of work ahead of you. The big discussion now is, as you enter into phase 2, is site development. And I just think that as a whole, the legislature has asked you to look under every stone to make sure you get the maximum benefit for the state itself. And I believe that state land should be used or considered for sites, possible sites, whether it be Mass DOT land or Massport land or MBTA land, to get the maximum dollar for the state itself. So as you consider siting of these resorts, I like to refer to them as resorts and not casinos, because the end result is something that has to last for the next 40, 50 years. It doesn't matter how quickly you open them. They have to stay in existence. They have to become part of the state. So I just like to leave that with you. I know you've had a lot to think about, but I think state land should be considered for siting of such a development. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay, what I think we'll do is suspend this hearing on the regs until we see whether anybody else comes in between now and 10 o'clock, because we did post 9 to 10 as the time that would be available. And if anybody comes into another site, if Commissioner Stebbins or Commissioner McHugh, if you would speak up, but otherwise we will go on to other business on our agenda. So let's go to item, is there anything else that we need to do to suspend it properly? Is that all right? Okay. Let's go on to the meeting minutes, agenda item 3, Commissioner McHugh.
We have, Mr. Chairman, three sets of minutes, minutes for April 11, April 18, and April 25. The minutes all are in their new form, prepared by General Counsel Blue, Assistant Secretary General Counsel Blue, and Counsel Artem Shadnov. So I would welcome comments on the form, but let's start with the April 11 minutes and use that as a sort of bellwether for the form and then the content as well. So I'd first ask for comments and then ultimately a vote on the April 11 minutes.
Anybody got comments on format?
I
Commissioner
like the new
McHugh,
format.
I actually like the format. I think it was easy to read, and by including the transcript pages, if one of us needs more detail, it's would be easy to retrieve the additional information. So I am in favor of this new method, and I know that our legal staff have so many responsibilities. This is cuts down on some of the work that they all do.
And Commissioner Stebbins, I heard you say that you liked the format, right?
Correct.
Yeah. I do too. It's a little bit more substantive than I was concerned. There is enough substance there that you get a little bit of a takeaway. So I was comfortable with it as well.
Same here.
Okay.
It's cut down to about 2 hours from about 6. The amount of time it takes to prepare them. So that's an additional savings for the legal staff, which has an enormous amount of work to do. And I too think it's comprehensive and succinct and if more detail is needed, we know where to go to get it.
Okay, good.
So, I would then move that the
I'm sorry,
April 11 minutes. Whoops.
I'm sorry, I
would
did
then
have, I
move-
just, sorry. Why don't you go ahead
I
and
would
move?
move-
Go ahead and move.
I would move that the April 11 minutes be accepted as submitted.
Second.
Just a question that's raised by the minutes, but not about the minutes. On page 2, we talk about, after completion of the investigations, the IAB will prepare a report to the commission, and the commission will hold a public hearing and receive public comments. Is that, have we clarified that that is in fact the process that we're going through? Is that for each one of the applicants? Is that in fact the process? Yeah. Yes?
Uh,
Are going to discuss it in more detail, but yes, that is the
Okay.
process.
Okay. I hadn't remembered that there was a public hearing and public comments on every recommendation from, okay. Okay. Fine. Any other comments on the April 11 minutes?
On that point, Mr. Chairman, I think we have the power to have public comments. I don't think there's an obligation to do so, but we can clarify that as we move forward.
All right, so we'll get, that's what I was thinking too, but we'll talk about that later on. Okay.
Right.
I don't want to leave a misimpression in the minutes that we're committed to something if we aren't necessarily committed to it, so, is it all right to just let this stand as it stands, Commissioner McHugh? Let that sentence,
I'm comfortable, and we can certainly correct it if we need to as we move forward.
okay, fine. All right, all in favor of the motion to accept the 11 minutes? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
We have to do this by roll call.
Yeah, sorry, I
Mr. Chair.
forgot that. All right. We'll start with Commissioner Stebbins.
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh.
Yes.
Commissioner Zuniga.
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron.
Yes?
And the chair also votes yes. The minutes are accepted as written.
All right, so now I move to the April 18 minutes and move that they be, open them for comment first of all. And if there is no comment, I'd move that they be accepted as tendered.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, Commissioner Stebbins,
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh,
Yes?
Commissioner Zuniga,
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron,
Yes?
and the chair votes yes.
And finally then, Mr. Chairman, the April 25 minutes, I'd move that they be accepted as tendered.
Second.
Second.
We have a new person on the website. No, he's gone.
That's our technician here who's
I think it was,
diligently maintaining this connection.
I think it was the CIA.
I don't know. Just a little airtime.
On discussion of these minutes, on the first page, it says the May 2 meeting has been canceled. The commissioners would like to postpone discussion on the standard procedure of public comment until all commissioners are present. This was the recommendation that, or the suggestion that Executive Director Day had made, that we might want to consider having an opportunity for public comment. I guess you weren't, that's not on our agenda to talk about today particularly, right? But you did want it, you were suggesting that we talk about that at some point. Okay, so you've got it, that's on your tickler file somewhere, because it's worth talking about. Okay. All right, any further discussion? All in favor, Commissioner Stebbins,
Aye.
Commissioner McHugh,
Aye.
Commissioner Zuniga,
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron,
Yes?
and the chair also votes yes. All right, we're moving on. We have your technical assistant up on the web again. I don't know that we really need him.
I know.
Nothing personal.
No, I know that.
Rob, is there some reason why we're broadcasting 4 camera shots?
Your picture is being broadcast to all 3
All right.
locations.
All right, don't worry about it. Let's move ahead to item number 4, Administration, Executive Director Day. How did the move go, or the packing go?
Mr. Chairman, and staff would like to join with everybody else in wishing you a happy birthday.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, it's good to return from the West Coast. The task was completed. Although I have to acknowledge Jan is still present finishing the task.
Right,
But-
right.
But I get to come and
Nice,
announce it's
yeah.
completed, so that's helpful.
Mission accomplished.
Yes. Thank you for asking. What I'd like to do is to start with briefly here and just identify some topics, first of all, relative to what we anticipate will be coming up in the future, just to make sure if the commission wants to tweak that to process or add some additional topics, we're aware of them so we can incorporate them in our planning. And I'll just run down them real quick. The first one that we anticipate bringing forward is a timetable and process schedule recommendation relative to Region C. And I'm glad Mr. Ziemba is paying attention in Fall River because I plan on assigning this particular topic to him for presentation, coordination and presentation to the commission.
And this is scheduled for the 16th, right?
Yes, thanks
Yeah.
for this is
Yeah.
scheduled for the next regular scheduled meeting
Right.
on May 16th.
Right.
And I might add then along with that, of course, we anticipate that we'll be taking a look at the final rules that incorporate the comments that we received in this process and in today's testimony.
So we're going to have the discussion about the comments on the 16th.
That's the plan at this point,
Okay.
correct? Then the next topic that we look at presenting would be really a review of the 36 steps to licensing, the withdrawal process, and the suitability recommendation and determination process, plus any staff notes where there might be some weaknesses or refinement needed in that process. And I've asked Catherine Blue to coordinate staff and present this picture for the commissioners. We would anticipate this would be a good time as we get then into mid-June, where we anticipate having the suitability reports come forward. The commissioners would have this reminder, and the public, the reminder of the entire process in advance enough to make some difference for that meeting.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to do here, and one of our previous speakers mentioned it, is that most of our investigation, most of the investigation materials collected contains confidential material. So we of course are continuing to strive to make sure that this process is transparent. What we want to do is to ensure all our applicants and their business information that we intend to appropriately protect that material that is confidential. And we wanted to make sure that was clear as we move forward with the process.
Well, I was going to bring this up during the legal report, but as long as you brought it up now, so what Attorney Conroy said was that in the secondary round of information, which was not on the original forms, apparently 25 questions, that there is no formal assurance from the commission that either all that information or some critical portions of that information are confidential. How are we addressing that?
And I could comment generally to the
Okay.
process because staff have been having some meetings regarding that process and the reports as we come forward, which is obviously a lot of material. And so what we anticipate is well, let me pause a minute. In the end, I think what ends up happening is, of course, it's not ultimately up to the commission. There's the process that takes place and through the Secretary of State's office, or as I am made familiar, that could be the end determination. But what we want to do is make sure we look at all that information and protect that information that is appropriately held confidential. So we're in that process right now, and I'm really confident that we're going to be able to look at the information come forward with protection so that that information that is confidential is not disclosed, and answer the questions that the applicants have as we move forward.
But is that, so is that by way of saying that what Attorney Conroy said is right, that we haven't yet given the people, we haven't yet designed a policy, a formal policy? We don't know for sure what we think we can keep confidential and what we can't?
I think we're pretty sure what is confidential, but there's a number of exceptions, so I think that's part of it. And I think part of what creates the doubt is in the process of trying to answer the question correctly, that ultimately there's a determination placed that is not within the commission about that people are a little bit hesitant about making clear statements that this information will be protected by the commission.
Okay.
So
Well,
that's what we have to clarify.
All right, well, but they will the applicants will understand that certain things are beyond our control. But what we want to say to them as clearly as we possibly can, what our standards are. And for this kind of stuff, I think I at least, and I think all of us have tried to make clear to the applicants, this is not a place where we're pushing for transparency. We're in favor of, protecting arguably confidential information to the maximum extent that the law will permit. This is not part of our transparency strategy here. So from my standpoint, we should be as proactive within the limits of we understand the law and the rules as we can to assure, to set a standard and then to articulate that standard and to as much as possible defend that standard. Because in this case, I think we are we're on the same side as the applicants are. So I just want to, I think we should be really proactive about this and try to articulate a strategy as cleanly and as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Chairman. As a matter of fact, that's very helpful to us because that's exactly what we're looking at. We were at the point where we've had enough questions. We felt it was important to start coming forward to re-emphasize that the great majority of this information that comes in is confidential. And we wanted to establish that as an expectation in the first place and then reassure our applicants that we are prepared and will move forward with steps to protect the appropriate information.
Okay. Well, if you take Attorney Conroy at face value, he at least doesn't know where we're coming from as a formal matter, and we should fix that as quickly as we can.
I understand.
Yeah.
We will be happy to do that, actually.
Okay. Sorry, were you?
No, it's essentially that. I guess that the point is, just like we have done for the specimen form, can we do for all the additional information? But it's obviously been discussed.
This raises a secondary issue, though. These 25 questions, you may know this.
Well, well, what I know is that it is not cookie cutter. There are not the same questions for every applicant at all.
Oh, okay.
When you conduct an investigation, one question will lead to another and a request for additional documentation based on that investigation. So, to the best of my knowledge, there is no additional 25 questions. It is applicant-based, depending on the qualifiers and information that may be needed accordingly. So that much I'm clear about, and the confidentiality piece. I know that I've had conversations about that because people have asked me that same question. It is information. In fact, I know that there are some people that have been hesitant to be interviewed, and it's because they don't know about the confidentiality piece. So that.
Okay. Well,
that helps.
Yeah, well, that does help. There's two issues. One is the confidentiality. I think we've articulated a view on that. But I was wondering, how come I didn't know about these 25 questions? But if I understand now that this is just a case-by-case follow-up, then that's a different story. So there is there a set of second-round questions which routinely go to everybody?
That is not my understanding, and Commissioner Cameron described it, and that's why the number of questions, as Kevin reflected, I wasn't thinking of disputing whether it was 25 or 10 or whatever it was. That's
Yeah.
not the important process. But in each one of those investigations, there have been follow-up questions.
Right.
And whether they're 25 or 50 or 100 or 10, that I couldn't answer. But I do know that with each interview, there are follow-up questions and follow-up requests for information, how that ultimately is told. And our problem is, or what we're trying to do is make sure that we look at the information and respond to the applicants and even ask them, if we haven't already been told, what are the reasons they feel it's confidential, because that's a part of the process to make sure we have that supportive information as we move forward. So it's
Yeah.
not really a standard, we've got 25, we're going to
Right,
release
okay.
it. It's an ongoing investigative process, and it starts with the recognition that most of that information is in fact confidential. I guess that's what I'm trying to clearly emphasize and make sure that our applicants and those that are qualifiers in submitting the information understand that, so we know that.
Okay.
As I paused right in the middle, and then the other major area on May 16th, of course, is the evaluation process, and how a proposal as to how that might move forward. And I'd like to comment a little bit more in that detail, so I'll just hold off and come back here as I finish the rest of these comments. We do need to revisit the master schedule, and I'll talk about that briefly, but we really need the evaluation process. We need to pin that down a little bit better, so we've got a better idea of what the timeline will be on that in order to incorporate it into the master schedule itself, because that'll be a significant time period that we'll need to go forward with. Other administrative items is we are making progress in filling key positions. The workforce and supplier development and diversity position, research and problem gambling position, chief information officer, chief financial and accounting officer, and licensing director are all moving forward. We have finalists that we're looking at in the workforce position and the research and problem gambling position. We are beginning a search, get some search assistance with the chief financial officer, and we are screening applications and resumes with the chief information officer and the licensing director. So all four of those are moving fast. Two of them are on track here. We hope to come up with a qualified applicant in the near future.
Great.
We're also continuing to work with the Collins Center to organize and to begin the performance management process within the Gaming Commission itself, and we'll continue to work on the transition to incorporate the executive director in the process. So I appreciate your continued patience as we find our way through that process. The other two items I want to comment briefly on the agenda. The master schedule. At the last meeting, we proposed potential. One of the big proposals was to move the application date to early December.
Second, I think.
December 2nd. And of course, the other dates that we talked about is establishing a more realistic time frame for the suitability reports. And I know that Commissioner Zuniga has incorporated those, and so it's all right with the chairman. I'll defer to Commissioner Zuniga on that process. And then budget as well. We are, of course, trying to, as we move forward, develop a 2014 budget for the Commissioner's consideration, so we have that in place and ready to go. So we'll present a proposal to the Commissioners for adoption, or consideration, I should say.
Is this still all on the 16th? Or
No,
this is just other.
I moved
this is
off the
coming.
16th.
Okay,
I
fine.
forgot.
Right.
Paused.
16th was good.
I paused a little bit, but
Yeah.
then roared
Okay.
right along.
Okay.
So Commissioner Zuniga, I know, has some additional budget items, so I'd like to defer to him on those as well for discussion. The next topic that I have is the evaluation process, and Mr. Chairman, if you'd like me to move into that or pause briefly for Commissioner Zuniga to weigh in on the master schedule and the budget, whichever way you'd like.
Well, yeah, let's go ahead with either or both. I think you're going to be talking with Ombudsman Ziemba on the schedule.
Correct.
But however much of either of those two things you want to bring up, go ahead.
Sure. I'll speak conceptually to the schedule and can speak in more detail if you need me to. We made the. I don't have the tool.
I'm having difficulty hearing. You, Commissioner Zuniga.
Is this better, Commissioner?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, I'll remain close to the microphone. The schedule, we don't have the tool here with us. I didn't anticipate that with this, that today, that we'll present it in lieu of the fact that we have three cameras here. But we have made the updates to the tool that Director Day was just describing, and come up with some forecast states relative to the award of the licenses. Much of it has to be further updated to really reflect the time that the referendum is going to take place at each of the host communities, because that is really a date that then triggers a lot of the subsequent dates relative to the surrounding community discussion, which, given our rules in terms of notification, hearing, and then limits in terms of dates prior to the award of the license, really drive that schedule. So those dates have not yet been incorporated, which will really allow us to give an ultimate forecast. We should contemplate whether that should be modeled in the schedule by region or by applicant or by type of license. That's not currently yet modeled. But that's something that we should do, and I will continue to model with the help of our consultants and Ombudsman Siemba, because that's really what will drive more certainty relative to the award dates. I can take questions to that effect, or more comments if you need me to.
The only supplement I'd have is that one of the key dates, of course, is that decision regarding whether or not we want to establish that earlier application date. And then, of course, with the once we get the evaluation piece, which we're planning to have a proposal for commission consideration on the 16th, it could be possible that then we could look at the master schedule on the 30th, depending on the commission's decisions prior to that.
So when are you thinking we would make the final decision on whether to move the start date, the application date, to early December?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that would be when the commission's prepared, but today would be fine, or the 16th, if you want to think about it some more, and then we'll have the evaluation information forward, and then at that point would probably be
Okay.
very good.
I mean, certainly from what I've seen and heard in reaction to the recommendation, and I have had a chance to read all of the submissions that we've got, it seems to me like there's some, but very, very little resistance to the idea of moving the date up with the other adjustments that we've come up with. So I'd be perfectly happy to decide today, but sometimes I want to move more quickly than other people, and maybe not everybody's had a chance to read comments. But I think again, going back to what Attorney Conroy was saying, that is the seminal date for everybody, and the faster we can make the decision, the better. So maybe let's talk about whether we want to decide that today, or do we want to wait until the 16th?
We could perfectly do that. I always thought of, when thinking about schedule, I always think of the latest date, and then we could always go from there. When we issue the RFA Phase 2 formally with the application form of response, that to me is the latest date to issue a date certain for the deadline. We could issue a deadline, anytime. We can show it in a schedule tool, as we have done up until this point. We can continue to do that, but the latest date, in my view, to issue a deadline is when we issue the form of response and invite responses. Because if we change it afterwards, bidders could legitimately claim that we're moving the rug from under their feet.
And if we're go ahead, Commissioner.
No,
Conroy.
is there any reason to wait, though, to do that? I guess is the question.
No, there isn't. I mean, let me speak to what I guess I've.
We'll get to you. I see Ombudsman Ziemba. We'll get to you in a sec.
What Ombudsman Siemba has been talking to communities and communicating well and brokering like he does, has been, in my estimation, the timeline and dynamics relative to host community agreements, surrounding community process, and referendum. And that's a very important piece of the schedule. In my view, there's also another important piece. When we move deadlines, then applicants are given less or more time to respond, to work on the response. Working on the host and surrounding communities is a big piece of the application, but it's not the only piece. The other piece, the filling out the response, understanding what may or may not be confidential in that response, for example. All of that has to be responding in a way that that in their view increases their chances based on the criteria that we have laid out. All of that takes place in parallel with the host and surrounding community process. So when we shrink the time, that other piece has to be considered. Now, I understand that also is a conversation that Ombudsman Siemba may be having, but it's good to hear, for example, today Attorney Conroy say that at least one of the applicants will work with that deadline. I'd be curious as to whether others have the same view.
Ombudsman Ziemba, do you want to speak to this?
In regard to setting the deadline
Put your
today,
close to the
I
mic,
think
please.
in regard to setting the deadline today, I think it might make sense to fully incorporate the comments on our evaluation process into the deadline, as Director Day just spoke about. He's in the process of to go into our evaluation process. That hasn't been muddled into the deadlines that we've discussed. Continue to feel very confident, based on looking at the comments that we received, that the recommendation to move the deadline forward by basically 1 month is a good recommendation. But I do note that there are comments on both sides of the matter. We had comment notably from MAPC, where they explained that there's tremendous pressures out there in host communities and in surrounding communities to meet the deadlines that we've set, and that they actually recommended that we move the deadline, instead of where we currently stand at the end of December, ahead of a month. And then we also did receive comment that potentially we should set it even sooner than we currently have, given the amount of days that it would take to evaluate these proposals, to set public hearings and other considerations that go into the process after the application. So, like you, Mr. Chairman, I remain pretty confident that the early December date is a workable one, and that it allows us to continue on in our work and get our evaluations done in a time that is around the date that we've been talking about for numerous months. I think it might make sense to incorporate some of Director Day's analysis into the deadline discussion.
Okay. Well, I think it makes sense. Let's don't finalize it today. Let's let a little bit more time go by. There's still, 6 to 7, 8 months, whichever date we pick. Given all this conversation, not just what we've had now, but all this comments that I've seen to this question, as well as all the other conversations that are going on about deadlines and so forth, I'd be interested to have you think about whether we could make it yet another month sooner. What would be, and I'll ask other folks out there too who are watching, could we consider making it the 1st of November rather than the 1st of December? What are the consequences to that? We don't need to talk about that right now, but but from as I'm hearing, I understand what the issues are relative to surrounding communities, and that we have to look at carefully. But I'd like to think about maybe making the 1st of November. So maybe, John, if you would, help think that process through a little bit, and let's see if we can May 16th, make a final decision on which date we're going to come up with.
One thing I'd recommend, Mr. Chairman, is that I have sort of very informal conversations with applicants all the time, but given the importance of the timetable, if we could have a little bit more of a formal comment by the applicants and obviously any surrounding communities, RPAs, and other representatives on that deadline, we incorporated that into our current regulation comment period. But to the extent that by at least the next meeting or sometime before that, that we receive more specific comments on the ability of each of the applicants to meet any of those deadlines and what their current projected timetables are. One thing I'll note is just in the paper, for example, the Milford applicant reported to Milford that it anticipated that its referendum would occur at the end of October. I believe it was October 28th or so. But just because it can get a referendum done slightly before November 1st, according to its projected schedule, does that still allow enough time for it and other applicants to get in their applications to us? But we received no comments specifically from the Milford applicant during this period of time, and I'm just using them because they have been publicly reported as it is a little bit later in the process of determining how they're going forward. But I think it would be very useful to receive more official comments from all the applicants about their plans on these, and of course, representatives from surrounding communities on whether or not we can meet the deadlines.
Okay. Yeah, I know what the surrounding communities are going to say. But let's put that up as a question to ask for formal feedback. We could even, we could even do this we could do it differently for the regions if we wanted to. I suppose we could have an application date that would be different for one region than it would be for another. If it turned out, for example, that all the applicants were in one region were fine with it, but all the applicants in another weren't and had been relying on our earlier date, we could stagger it, which would, be helpful in a certain respect. So anyway, let's ask for formal comment on that and see if we can tie this down on the 16th. Commissioner McHugh?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I would very much like to tie this down on the 16th. We've looked at a variety of different dates. We've gotten some helpful and thoughtful comments on this first go-around, and we can certainly ask for additional comments, but if we get additional comments, it would be particularly helpful to me, and I suspect to all of us, to have some specifics rather than it's going to be very difficult for us to do one thing or another, so that we could figure out how to meet the difficulties that are being projected, because I think there are going to be ways to do that. One of the commentators this time around talked about the number of days that it's going to take to do a variety of things that we have to do in the approval process. And there are ways to deal with that, to shrink those days down, I think, that we can discuss. But I really think that it'd be helpful to all of us, as well as to the commentators, to ask for specific illustrations of the time that's needed to accomplish certain tasks, so that we can attempt ameliorate them in some other way.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think you were talking. They're posted on our website. I think you were talking about the Suffolk Downs comments on this most recent question, and although I happen to think they were mistaken about some stuff, nevertheless, it was helpful to have an applicant talk in such careful detail about the impacts. So I totally agree with you. That's really helpful. And when we do understand, just to reiterate your point, when we do understand the concerns, we can often figure out workarounds. I think we all set. So Commissioner Stebbins, are you looking to say something?
No,
Okay.
I'm fine with that suggestion.
Okay. All right, so we'll put the question up as for as specific feedback as possible. All of us, I think, I know, because as I see all the comments coming in, all of us, staff, commissioners, applicants, surrounding communities, everybody is increasingly understanding the intricacy of this process and the nuance of this process, and the more questions we ask, the more better understanding we get of all the issues. So I think this is a constructive process, and we will look forward to 2 more weeks of questions, and then we'll see whether we can button this up on March 16th. Okay, that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to do something about the budget?
Yes, I can. As Director Day was outlining, we'll be working in the next month or so to present, formulate and present a fiscal year 14 budget. As you'll recall, we have approved a budget for fiscal year 13. It ends on June 30th, and we are contemplating a number of expenditures as we speak. I'll be talking about later the research agenda, Mr. Chairman, that has a big implication in the budget and the cash flow. As I was mentioning last meeting, when in a previous update relative to the research piece, we intend to assess our applicants for certain costs of investigations for RFA Phase 2, as well as assessing our licensees for certain costs once they become licensed, that will effectively go to defray some costs of both the research and other costs of the commission. But until such time, we need to really figure out the cash flow implications that some of these expenditures have, because we were appropriated, if you will, we were loaned a certain amount that we need to preserve and carefully consider as we make these large budget expenditures.
And just to be clear on this, and I'm totally fine with this. And we were loaned $15 million. There was considerable debate in the legislature about how much money we would need before we were able to start becoming self-sustaining by assessing licensees for our operating costs, which is eventually what will happen. And the range was anywhere from 15 to 50 million was necessary. No one really had any idea. We got the 15 million, and the 15 million will probably hold us through pretty much all of next year, particularly because we're able to lay off some of our operating costs on like the background investigations and so forth on other sources of revenue. But the issue that we need to address is to make sure that for however long this licensing process takes us, that we have the operating capital to do it. And that can mean reassessing expenditure decisions. It can mean looking for new sources of income. It can mean speeding up the process. It can mean any number of things. But there's no need to be bashful about addressing this issue, just like we're addressing, if we happen to run late on the licenses, because the right way to do the licenses is to run late, we'll run late. And if we need to figure out a way to stretch our money, because it's going to take us a while to do the licenses, because that's the right thing to do, we'll figure out a way to stretch our money. So that's the conversation. I appreciate that you've been leading us on this, and there's no issue about having this squarely on the table. And big expenditures like multiple millions of dollars for research and $1 million for performance management and $1 million for my salary, and all these are big expenses. And
That's the one thing I disagree with you.
but so I'm clear that this is an important topic, and we can't shrink from facing it straight up.
Right, and just to emphasize some of that, many of the expenditures we're contemplating for fiscal year 14, really, as we formulate the budget, have not really been determined. As we make the decisions that we are also talking about, relative to the mix of advisors, for example, the model for coordinating those advisors, additional hires that may be down the pipeline after the ones that Director Day is mentioning, but that come in fiscal year 14. Many of those assumptions, I guess, have, I don't guess, they do have a monetary implication, and we need to make assumptions to project those costs. But some of those can only come after we make some of the decisions that are imminent.
Yeah, and just one other thing. We'll speak about this at more when we talk about the research. But I said as this process unfolds, we're all learning the intricacies of the system and learning things that we didn't really understand beforehand. The legislature mandates that we do a very comprehensive baseline assessment of socioeconomic conditions, but it's meant to be paid for out of the Public Health Trust Fund, but the Public Health Trust Fund doesn't get money until after we've licensed everybody, which is too late to do the baseline study. I don't think anybody ever contemplated that when the legislature was thinking about it. So we're stuck with trying to figure out how do we do the legislative mandate of getting this study done when the revenue source isn't there yet. So we're all learning as we go. Commissioner McHugh, were you about to say something?
No, Mr. Chairman, when we get to the research agenda,
Okay.
I'll come back.
Okay, fine. Great. So are you set then on the budget?
Yep, I don't have any other updates. We'll continue this discussion as we formulate the fiscal year 14 budget.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Commissioner Cameron. Reminded me that we are now past 10 o'clock. So let's suspend the discussion on the rest of the agenda and return to the discussion about the RFA2 regs. Has anybody else come forward in any of our locations that wishes to speak about the regs?
We have two additional guests. I don't know if either of those two guests would like
You-
to come forward.
Close to the mic,
talk about
Bruce.
the RFA.
Bruce, close to the mic.
We have two additional guests that have joined us here in Marlborough. I'll ask them if they have any interest in coming forward to comment or testify in the regs. No takers.
Okay.
There are none in Fall River, Mr. Chairman.
There are speakers?
There are none in.
There are none,
in
okay.
Fall River.
Okay. Then I think we have met our stated obligation of staying open for regs and comments from 9 until a little after 10. So if the process is fine, we will close off the hearing on the regs. Is that all right? And move back to the agenda. And Executive Director Day's report.
Thank you, Chairman Crosby. What I'd like to do now is enter into a discussion about the evaluation process. I think as the chairman reported at the last meeting, Commissioner Stebbins and Commissioner McHugh have been researching other similar processes. And perhaps I can defer to Commissioner McHugh if he'd be willing to kind of bring us up to date on their process and what they discovered generally. I'll have some additional thoughts, and as do Commissioner Stebbins and Zuniga. And then Commissioner McHugh and I plan to sort of take all this into consideration and get together next Tuesday to further work on a proposal that we'll be looking at on May 16th.
Let's, that's great. Let's just have a quick recess and before we start that and come back in 5 minutes and just go to Commissioner McHugh.
Thank you.
We were with Executive Director Day talking about evaluation process along with Commissioner McHugh. Commissioner?
Should I? All right, I'll take it from here. Commissioner Stebbins and I visited with a number of agencies in the Commonwealth who, in one way or another, dealt with approving, analyzing, and granting contracts for large projects to see how they go about the evaluation process and whether there is something that we could learn from the way they do things. We spoke, and each was very forthcoming and helpful to us. We spoke with the Department of Transportation, representatives of A&F, Massport, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, Mass Development, the Commonwealth's funding agency. We also talked with representatives of Moelis and Company, who are financial advisors that were responsible for, among other things, dealing with casino issues in Ohio, and now represent are the financial advisors in the Revel bankruptcy in Atlantic City. And we talked with individuals who were participants in this process, specifically Pam McKinney of the Byrne McKinney and Pinnacle Advisory Group, and Steve Cecil of the architectural firm, the Cecil Group. We looked at four basic elements of the evaluation process that each of these used, and I'm just going to touch on the highlights very briefly. But we looked at those four elements to see what we could learn and what was adaptable to our processes. I should say at the outset that nobody else faced exactly the same challenge that we face because they all had different interests. The BRA and the Department of Transportation and Massport are basically landlords or property owners who are dealing with a specific piece of property and trying to get the highest value for that. The BRA is basically dealing with a set of zoning issues and comprehensive planning issues with respect to a specific piece of property. And the ANF and Mass Development are looking at financial proposals for a specific piece of property. Nobody else is looking at competitive processes that deal with different properties in different areas. So that's a major difference. Nonetheless, there are some things that in four areas that we thought were helpful and that we looked at. That is the content of the RFPs that were used by these entities to solicit proposals, the review process, the composition of the review team, and the form that the award took. So let me just touch briefly on each of those. In each case in which one of the entities issued an RFP, the RFP contained detail regarding what the proposals had to contain and the form in which they had to, the bidders had to submit it. And that allowed for both certainty on the part of the applicant, the bidder, as to what they had to provide, and allowed, because of the form specificity, a comparison of apples to apples, and allowed an easy, more or less, way to look at components of the various proposals as they came in. Each of the RFPs contain evaluation criteria that would be used in selecting the winning applicant in general order of importance. None attach specific weights to the criteria, and each contained disclaimers saying that saying in essence that the overall objective of the exercise was to get the best value for the Commonwealth, and that the awarding authority, be it MassDOT, be it the Mass Board, would use its best judgment as to which proposal would yield that value. Nonetheless, the clarity with which the criteria were stated was important, not only in the view of all of the people with whom we talked, not only so that the bidders would understand what the criteria were, but so that the evaluators could assure that they were focusing on the criteria with some precision as they went through the analytical process. So those were the highlights of what we discovered about the RFPs. We obtained samples of RFPs that are on the shared drive from a number of the entities, and they're there for staff and the commissioners to review. The review process, once the bidders submitted their proposals, differed. Because in some of the entities had large staffs that engaged in this process, And so the review process was largely staff-driven with some outside consultants. Others did not have any staff to speak of and used a team of consultants to review the processes. The Massport and DOT and BRA in particular had largely staff-driven processes. And that's because they do this over and over again in a continuing fashion and build up within the agencies the expertise that's necessary to review a number of different aspects of the proposals. Mass Development and A&F, on the other hand, did not have large staffs, relied typically on outside input for the review that they created. Each of the proposals, each of the entities, in some way or another, got community input as part of the analysis process. The BRA created an independent advisory group composed of neighborhood residents, citizens, community leaders. DOT put together an advisory group in largely the same fashion. Massport did most of its community input through its community relations office, but all three of those entities relied heavily on community input at all stages of the process, leading up to formulation of the final proposal to the board, in order both to get feedback from the community and also to build community acceptance and buy-in of the proposal as it moved forward. At the end of all of the entities, whether they assembled teams from the outside, and I'll get to that in a second, or whether they relied on an inside team, staff-driven team, assembled a specific team for a specific project and put that project, put that team under the leadership of a team leader. So that there was either an internal or an external team leader for the analysts who were looking at the proposals and making recommendations about them. In the end, each of the entities created what had various names, but was in essence a recommendation to the approving board for the essential terms of the deal that they were recommending. They did not necessarily specify all of the terms of the package, but they specified the essential terms that required board approval. And they did that because of a recognition that after the award, it was likely that there would have to be further refinement of specifics and minutiae. There'd have to be tracking. There'd have to be some changes as things went along. And those did not necessarily have to go back to the approving board for review. But the essential terms of the deal, for example, in the case of DOT doing a lease deal, the length of the lease, the amount of the lease, the amount of the rental, the amenities that would be used to generate that revenue, the kinds of uses to which the property would be put. Those kinds of essential terms were part of the recommendation that was presented to the board. None of the groups, with one exception, used a numerical review or weighting system. All used verbal systems, some comparative, some not, but they all used, with one exception, verbal assessments or comparative rankings to come up with their final recommendation. In terms of the review team, who was on the review team, there was this sharp difference between the entities that did this over and over again and those that didn't. The Department of Transportation, Massport, and BRA had in-house staffs that did much of the work, although the Department of Transportation used an outside appraiser to set the value of the property and the yield that was reasonable to expect. So even there, they used outside expertise to create the benchmark against which they would measure proposals. Massport used an outside appraiser and a design consultant for design and costs to help them determine whether not only the yield that the property should bring, but also whether the proposal that was being made by the respondents was realistic and achievable, as opposed to some kind of a pie-in-the-sky proposal that really would not have any likelihood of succeeding. Mass Development and A&F relied heavily on outside consultants. Mass Development had a review manager in charge of the outside consultant team, and then it had business consultants and real estate consultants, and they provided us with a helpful list of the qualities and attributes of the members of the team. But they were looking at these proposals essentially from a financing aspect. A&F similarly put together an outside team of people to review the financial implications of the proposals they were making. The two individuals, Pam McKinney and Steve Cecil, who participated in this process, suggested that there were two ways to go about assembling the team, and they'd been involved in both ways. One was to assemble, and we've talked about this at least informally, one was to assemble the individuals and then pick somebody to be the leader. Another way was to pick the leader and have the leader assemble the team. And that can be done through an RFP process that allows us to cherry pick from among the respondents members of the team that we would like the leader to employ if we choose to do so. The RFP could do that. But otherwise, picks a leader in whom we have confidence, and then allows the leader to go out and pick the members of the team that'll be the evaluators. Another way is that Steve Cecil had used, and he sent us a specimen contract, was to pick a firm, a large firm, specifying somebody in the firm in whom the awarding authority, us in this case, has confidence, and saying we'd like him to lead or her to lead the enterprise, but letting the firm then assign various firm members or outside consultants to the process. Finally, we looked at the forms of the award, and all of the awards except for the A&F award took the form of what they called term sheets, and I've described what they were. They contain the major components of the award. They allow the staff to manage minutiae or detail as it evolves over the course of the project. They were all uniform in their assessment that the project that's proposed is never exactly the project that is built, and there has to be some flexibility to take into account evolving conditions as they go forward without having to go through a rather cumbersome process of coming back to their boards to get additional formal approval. So they locked down the essential terms and conditions under which the award was made, in the expectation that it would only be deviations from those major terms that would require a return to the board, and that the staff would oversee the development with respect to matters of detail. A&F was different because at the end there were four parties to the agreement that they typically participated in. There was A&F, the developer, the municipality where the development was being built, and DOR, which was going to give some tax relief to the developer as it moved forward, and that took the form of a contract that was pretty specific as to the major financing elements and the major expectations and the major revenues to which the developer was committing and the major concessions that the municipality was giving in order to have the development created. So those were the highlights of what we found. There are a number of those things that I think are helpful to us as we look at our development of an evaluation process. So I look forward to those discussions as we move forward. But I'll stop at this point and ask Commissioner Stebbins if there are other things that I've omitted that you'd like to add or amplify on from our discoveries and our conversations.
Just real briefly, and as always, Commissioner McHugh does a great job at walking through the fine details and pulling that report together of the meetings that we had with those entities. Just to burrow down a little bit further, what was interesting, even though most of the entities described are focusing on one parcel of property, and for the most part trying to maximize the best financial value to the Commonwealth or to an agency through the development of that property. The BRA was interesting because not only were they looking for a financial return, but they expected the project and planned for the project to fit within their development plans. They specifically talked about a parcel of property adjacent to the Boston Convention Center, not only just one making the property available for lease, but complying with their plans for a hotel to be constructed on that site. So even though they were certainly looking for highest and best value, they were also looking for a development plan that met their needs in terms of their overall development strategy for that part of Boston. Again, just to echo the term sheet examples that we were shared from several of the entities, I think in the end may have some utilization in terms of how we may develop a license and our ability to attach conditions to a license agreement for an applicant. And also the notion of a project manager, be that somebody internal or external who helps usher the process through, make sure that we have the right evaluation teams participating. But you know, I certainly think as we move ahead, there would be an opportunity, knowing that we have kind of 5 categories of evaluation, that and there being 5 commissioners, that we ourselves might inject ourselves into the process to work with an evaluation team. But no additional comments beyond those to add to what Commissioner McHugh shared with us in outlining the process that we went through.
Commissioners, reactions? Or
I did have some.
yeah, go ahead.
I think this outline and the memo is very helpful. I think there's many similarities that some of these agencies and parties have to what we will be contemplating here as we figure out the details of the award and evaluation. The evaluation and award of the licenses. But as Commissioner McHugh suggests, I want to emphasize there is also very important differences. I would say that by virtue of the number of projects that some of these agencies review, that's a key difference to what we will contemplate here, and I'll speak to that in a few more minutes. But also the boards that review these projects are very different, in my opinion, to this commission. If we're trying to draw parallels to this commission, I actually see a board of the BRA, for example, or a board of DOT having a lot more similarities with the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee that this commission has, by virtue of when they meet, how often they meet, the fact that they have day jobs elsewhere, and the fact that those agencies also operate within the confines of of an executive, a secretary, for example, and ultimately the governor's office, or the mayor's office in case of the BRA. So as we talk about the role of this commission, I'm really particularly interested in what we have in our view to be the role of each of us and our staff, with the mix of our consultants, I guess, in how we implement that. But I think it's important similarities, but I will also just emphasize there's important differences. I also wanted to mention something else. I think these parties were very helpful, but I wonder if there's not another party that we should talk to, and that would be the Inspector General. I think the Inspector General the Inspector General's office spends a lot of time thinking about procurement procedures, enforcing rules and laws that do not apply to us, and I want to emphasize that. But because they think about those procedures under the confines of ensuring public confidence in all the processes that they contemplate, I think this is a party that would be, in my opinion, very helpful to consult with. I don't think we have formally. I think we ought to. Again, I want to emphasize that the rules that they enforce do not apply to us. That's explicitly stated in our statute, Chapter 30B and others. But they are very. They have spent, a lifetime, really, the lifetime of that office, trying to figure out what processes are best utilized on agencies like us. So those were a couple of thoughts. I'm really looking forward to a healthy discussion as to how these 4 items that are very well laid out here, the contents, the review team composition, the role of the commissioners and staff, and the mix of consultants, how we're gonna implement them, because I think that's key. It's critical as to how we're gonna do this. I have some opinions, but I'll reserve them when we get to that. I don't know if it's today or on the 16th, but I think it should be soon.
Commissioner Zuniga, could you help, I guess, Commissioner McHugh and I have a conversation with the IG in advance of our meeting on the 16th?
I do suggest that you do that. One thing that I'm gonna guess is gonna be unequivocally similar is the criteria that you articulate. Everybody, all of these agencies do seem to agree that the criteria should be very clear, and the process for evaluation of that criteria should be very clear to the bidders. That's a fundamental thing. And I'm back to my point about the differences. When you're DOT and you have 2 or so criteria, financial, the financial aspect and how that fits, for example, with the strategic plan, that's I would pose a lot easier compared to the criteria that we have, which is fundamentally complicated because some of it is competing. How do you maximize the revenues to the Commonwealth while mitigating the effects on a host or surrounding community, for example? That really butts against each other, in my view, in many ways. So as we contemplate how to implement and evaluate that criteria, that's the piece that I want to make sure that we communicate as clear as we can, because that's a paramount goal, if we can do that. But the short answer to that is yes. I would really encourage that you two speak and consult with some in the Inspector General's office.
Commissioner Cameron?
Yeah, I wanted to.
One of the things,
Go ahead, Commissioner McHugh.
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to thank the 2 of you. Comprehensive, thoughtful document what's clear to me is that there are so many options. There's not one approach that is successful, and that's apparent in speaking with many other jurisdictions from around the country, and actually the Singapore folks. So I as well look forward to discussing how we take all of this information and you know, put together a format that makes the most sense here. I agree with the transparency and clear-cut, you know, the bidders are understanding what we will be using. That has to be clear. And as far as the Inspector General, as many people as we can talk to is always helpful. So, but I do want to thank you. Very well done document.
Commissioner Stebbins, the point you made about the BRA, that you said something like they're not just looking for the highest and best value, they're looking for the integration of a plan into a larger development strategy. Was there a takeaway about that for us? Were you highlighting that because you thought that directly had a relevance to us?
Well, if I said the BRA, I correct myself. It was Massport. And I was somewhat intrigued because I think the Massport process, to a degree, may be a little bit closer reflective of the process we might envision, in that you know, we're going to take things into consideration like architecture and the site development, which is also what the Massport is considering. But obviously, having a plan for that site, in addition to maximizing the best value, I saw Massport's process out of all of them being somewhat similar to a process that we might move forward with, as well as the public involvement comment component to it.
Yeah, okay. I had a few other just random reactions and thoughts. One is to build on what Commissioner Zuniga said. The difference between those commissions and our commission is obviously really dramatic, and we're dealing with this with our whole operations, and this is something we've already talked about a lot with Executive Director Day. You know, his prior commission was a part-time commission, as most commissions are, and as all the commissions are that you looked at in this project. That means a staff intensity which would not be acceptable to me for this commission. If you look at the, and I know you weren't suggesting this, Commissioner McHugh or Stebbins, but just to make the point, there's the at DOT, it says ultimately, DOT staff sends the project they favor. And in another place, well, yeah, and they have this draft project input report, and then the staff essentially makes the decision. And I know you're not suggesting we should do that, but I just want to make it clear that that's a long way away from anything that I would find acceptable. And throughout our processes here, everything we're doing, we need to figure out how do we adapt conventional staff to commission operations to this situation with 5 full-time, extraordinarily capable commissioners. So we got to think about, that's just something I think we all understand that, but I want to highlight it because I think it's really important. The IG issue, you can't disagree with what Commissioner Cameron said. You know, there's no harm in the more people you ask, you always get something, but you do have to be a little bit careful of the questions one asks, because you're talking to people who have spent their lives enforcing rules, as you say, that we are not required to adhere to. And there are reasons why we're not required. But it will get people outside their comfort zone. They'll be talking and wanting to enforce or to reinforce in our minds standards and processes and so forth that don't apply. And you run the risk of, setting expectations. So I just think it's something that has to be thought through kind of carefully about how you get the good which can clearly come of it without sort of putting us in a situation where we're looked at askance for not doing what they live with all day long as the conventional procurement processes. This is a very different kind of procurement, and we're exempt from those rules for reasons.
Can
Sure.
I react to
Yeah.
that? I'm less concerned from an enforcement standpoint than from a training standpoint. I think what I'm suggesting.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Commissioner.
I'm sorry. My understanding of how the Inspector General sees itself is twofold, fundamentally twofold. As an enforcement agency, as I suggest on the one side, but also as a training agency. One that provides training to an advice to all the public agencies, cities, towns, procurement officials that may want at any time. I am thinking of it from that side of the house as we ask for their input. I think they would be the first ones to recognize that none of it applies, none of the rules that they enforce apply to us. But I think, again, from a process standpoint, I think their suggestions, and we should just take them as that, could be valuable as we try to make decisions. I think they will be non-binding. I don't think anybody should think of it that way.
Chairman Crosby?
Yeah.
If I could,
Close.
I looked at reviewed the memorandum too, and I had a few thoughts that I wanted to exchange with the commission to stimulate discussion.
Let me just I had two more things I
Go
wanted
right
to say.
ahead.
Let me just, sorry, if you don't mind. Just two other quick observations. One about public comment. We've done this in spades in this project, and we want to keep that up. But there is a kind of public comment that would be of interest and maybe value for the public not in a host or surrounding community. What are their views about which of the various proposals we get are the most valuable? And I don't know whether obviously the hosts and surrounding communities all have strong vested interests one way or the other. They're going to be either very positive or very negative probably over a specific site. But having the rest of the public, and I'm now looking at Director Driscoll in this, having the rest of the public have an opportunity to say, I think Suffolk Downs, I think Everett, I think Milford is good, bad, or indifferent, or these are reasons why I think rural is better than an urban, and whatever. We'll be getting comments from editorial boards. We'll be getting, and it might be worth thinking about. Is there any systematic way that we could invite comment from the broader public? So I just throw that out there. I think it would be interesting. I would certainly be interested to know if there was any systematic way to get any kind of constructive feedback from people about within each region about which site they thought was better or worse. And then my last point is, and this has been touched on, particularly as I was reviewing all the comments that came in over our regs, I realized that I didn't really know what it meant to make an award. Does it when we vote at the end of a day and we pick developer A over B and C, is that it? Is that the award, or does there have to be a huge contract negotiation? Because it certainly relates to the timing issue. And the timing issue relates to a variety of revenue streams, including the Commonwealth's revenue stream. And I just hadn't really thought that through yet. And I think it looks like people are in the process of addressing that issue. But when exactly the award is made that triggers the various revenue streams is a really critical step for us.
I feel I can add something in this that I'm familiar with. As Commissioner Stebbins was suggesting, when you're a landlord, when you're DOT and you are bidding something to be done on a piece of property that you own, you get a term sheet and eventually a contract. And there's maybe the award has to be made practically via a term sheet. But then that party, DOT, will enter ultimately into a lease arrangement by some term, by some conditions. We won't have that here, fundamentally. But the idea, because we don't own the land, for example, we're not landlords, we're awarding a license, which is a right to do something in the future. So there will be all kinds of conditions. I think the fundamental condition in the award is that they do what they say they're going to do. And there's a number of things that we have to put in place between the time we award that license and we let that operation open for business, in terms of monitoring to make sure that they effectively deliver what they promised. But again, emphasizing the idea of a term sheet, the notion here is that by its very nature, that project is going to be very conceptual. There's going to be drawings, there's going to be a site, and there's going to be all kinds of great plans. But that's it. After that, there's a number of things that have to happen, and there's a lot of work that we have to do to monitor, and how best we can memorialize that. It's something that we need to think about. But perhaps more importantly, how do we make sure that we what's coming to fruition is what they are, what we agreed to, is something that we need to be closely monitoring.
Yeah, that's a separate issue from the one I was talking about, but they're both important. I agree. And it might be interesting to ask other jurisdictions. Maybe our consultants would tell us. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, where there were awards made, what was the trigger mechanism? What defines award for purposes of generating the revenue? I mean, that might be we might be able to get some advice from them. Okay, that was my last comment. So. Fire away.
Thank you, Chairman. From my perspective, I just have a few thoughts and observations to throw out to the Commission, and my purpose is to stimulate some discussion for Commissioner McHugh and I as we get back together to talk about this whole process on Tuesday. And it's my understanding with the Commission's end result is the granting of a license, and upon granting of a license, then that is the key for the revenue streams, but obviously we want to make sure that that's correct. The granting of the license to me is a process that is conditional. There has to be conditions, and those conditions are, at least as I understand it, would be conditions about the application, whatever the applicant put in their application. It would be the responses and evaluation criteria, whatever that was. Public hearing, whatever the applicant committed to a public hearing, so that essentially, I think as Commissioner Zuniga addressed, that actually ties them, once they get a license, they can't just change direction. They are tying themselves to what they're going to move forward with, and then falls in the process, as you suggested, the after the fact follow-up on the construction process in that particular area. The public comment, I think, is very interesting as well, because one thing we didn't talk is a number of these processes that Commissioner McHugh and Commissioner Stebbins went through also involved, many of them involved some form of public advisory, some form of outside input into the process in different manners, which is something as well that I think is worthwhile. I agree it's worthwhile considering as we move forward. And what ultimately I'm trying to suggest, and see if this is some direction the Commission wants to move forward, is a process that really takes this huge amount of information in an application and moves it kind of down into what would be reasonable and effective for the Commission to consider, and assure itself that it's involved effectively in the process itself. So that's what I'm trying to get to. I think that would be useful in the process, and and in taking into consideration what has already been brought forward by Commissioners McHugh and Stebbins. And of course, as we start, the initial part is
Mike,
go forward.
yeah.
The initial part is the application itself. So I think we're now working to make sure we have that material available the first week in June. But I think one thing that I saw consistently as well is to try to make sure the questions we are asking are as clear and as detailed as we can, to then ensure that when we get responses from applicants, they in fact are consistent. They should have some manner of consistency in those responses, so it allows us to do comparisons about what it is we're looking at. And then as those applications come in, the initial process, of course, is the screening of the applications itself. Are they complete?
Right.
And in that process, most of that response would be something in many routine areas that staff can just respond back to the applicant and make sure that information is there. But there are very likely areas, could be areas, that are non-responsive, and that would be something that we need to come back to the commissioners for directions on how to proceed with that kind of situation if it develops. I have a thought that staff work groups in some fashion would be an appropriate screening tool to process that information. And there's a number of ways to break down those work groups, or a number of work groups which could be already, we've divided up the evaluation criteria, and I think about 5 different areas. That could be the subject of each work group. It could be additional subjects in particular that we wanted to emphasize. And then it would seem to me that's also an appropriate spot for the commissioners to assign themselves based on the expertise and delegation that you've already established. So that actually moves the commission right into direct participation in the product that comes out of those work groups early on in the process. In that continuing process of kind of funneling the information, I would suggest that it would be a good idea then to take a delegation really from each, or representative from each of those work groups, and then combine those evaluation processes of work groups into a full each application. And at that point, then, of course, the commission, it's kind of the product the commission would like in the end to consider. Would that be some kind of a ranking, 1 through 11 or whatever we end up with applicants, or would it be a application brief and maybe specific findings or observations plus a recommendation? At that point, it would be really up to the commission, and that's why I'm mentioning that as kind of some thought process about how much do you want to see at that point. If you were involved in the beginning of the process, how much do you want to see in this process? And then on top of that, of course, is the hearings. So as the commission conducts hearings, and I'm pretty confident that you want to hear from each one of these applicants about exactly what they are proposing. And so the idea would be in the end that you would have this product that's developed through the evaluation process, plus the facts brought in from the hearing process itself, to be able to ultimately come to a decision to award or grant a license as a privilege to do business in casino gaming and resorts in the state of Massachusetts. So that sounds short, but it's actually, I left a lot of other points out of it, but I thought something like that would be helpful, just to throw it out and say, here's a kind of a concept and that you might want to consider.
I think that's some great ideas. I look forward to the involvement of each one of us, each one of the commissioners in some of the groups that you articulate. I actually wanted to comment a little bit on something you may have left out just now, Director Day, and that is on relative to the mix of advisors and the role of advisors. Because I'm going to come from something perhaps on principle as to making sure that we're careful that we do not delegate an important role, whatever that may be, to an outside party. Whether it's a coordinating role or whether it's one of interaction or other. I believe the fundamental role of all the roles that are important in this evaluation process should reside in some form or fashion with somebody at the commission, whether it's yourself, staff, working groups, and that each one of those parties consult and get the advice of advisors, because we need them fundamentally. But I do not want this commission to be in a position of having delegated away to a third party that is not part of the commission too much of an important role. And I guess we could talk about it in more detail, but I come from that side.
I would agree with Commissioner Zuniga. That's very similar to what we did with investigations. Other jurisdictions turn the investigations over to contract investigators and just submitted a report for the commission's review at the end of the investigation. We chose not to do that, that we are in control of those investigations under Director Wells and the state police assigned to IEB. They are calling, they are making the decisions about how to proceed with the investigation. So I would agree that that's an important piece for us, is not to delegate.
Commissioner Zuniga, thank you for, I did omit that, but we are, and that's one thing that I'm hoping that the commission would be willing to give us some authorization to move forward on. I do feel, and I think the commissioners that I've been discussing it with as well, is that we will need add some expertise to this process. And so, and I would recommend we add it to these work groups. And of course, some example expertise I think you've already discussed would be architecture, design, financial, would be very helpful, I think, as evaluating these proposals as they move forward. What I was talking about is then the smaller group that actually consolidates all this information. And I've had some discussion about where or when the material would actually come before the commission in session. We talked a little bit about, well, maybe after these work groups, you bring that, but if you get 5 areas times 10 and 11 applications, that's a lot of material trying to conduct a public hearing about. So that's why I'm thinking it might be more practical to narrow that down by bringing one delegate from each one of those groups. And at that point, I was as well anticipating that I would join that group, and of course reinforcing what Commissioner Zuniga mentioned, and then that in the end, I'm responsible to make sure the process keeps moving. But I'd also think it would be appropriate to consider the possibility of adding a consultant in that process that would help me manage and move that forward to the commission. So that is a key step that I omitted, and I thank Commissioner Zuniga for bringing it up. But I do think our ability to move forward, we've started some identification, but I think it would be to our benefit to move forward with identifying what those various areas of interest are and moving forward with a process, RFP, or whatever we need to do to begin setting that up so we're ready for the commissioners to actually give us the go-ahead one way or the other. One thing we didn't mention in those work groups, besides the concept of possible involving some kind of advisory personnel or something, is that there may also be other state government agencies that would be helpful to the process that may be able to, can't speak for them, but may be able to loan us some expertise for the duration of that process as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Commissioner Stebbins, you've been working on a suggested list of consultant resources and working on RFPs are we at a point where you're ready for us to give authorization to put some RFPs out?
We're getting close. We have one RFP that's pretty complete with respect to financial advisory services. We've also got components which we can easily fold into an RFP for what I'd call the site development aspects. The AIA, as well as Mass Development, gave us some good feedback as to the team and the professions that we should consider tapping into for the site development considerations. I've also gotten some initial information on economic impact review, and I'm kind of drilling down on that a little bit further. And that fourth category of our criteria, which deals with mitigation, I can tell you that at least on the problem gaming criteria or evaluation, that both our friends at the Mass Council and Compulsive Gambling, as well as the National Council, have offered to help us review those pieces of the criteria.
Well, it's, what do Commissioner McHugh and Director Day see as the process for finalizing this? How are you envision that we would go forward from here to finalize the evaluation process, whether we do these teams, whatever?
Go ahead, Commissioner McHugh.
Well, I would envision that we talk next week, as Director Day plans, and come back with a proposal that takes the line that we've been discussing, that's been on the table for a while, and the 32 steps or the 36 steps that were proposed, and presents to the Commission for approval a process that is as detailed as we can make it, and also recommends the groups and the areas of responsibility for the groups and the other things that Director Day just talked about. Seems to me that would, if we can get that approved next week, the next time we meet, that would be an enormous help for us to determine the outside consultants that we need and the other assistance that we're going to need, and also to begin to determine what the timeline is going to look like, so that the master schedule can be revised to take account of that process. It seems to me that that's trying to get a handle around that process is the core of building out the resources that we need and the time it's going to take us to get done.
So that would be, so that, in your mind's eye, that would be on the 16th, that we would hammer this to the ground.
Yes, and I would agree with Commissioner McHugh.
Okay.
That's and the consultant issue I was talking about was more a matter of, we have to, in this process, determine or identify where we think the expertise needs to be, and going forward to identify who might be available to do that. And then
Right.
at that point, we'd have that to bring back to the Commission.
Right. Okay, yeah, well, I agree. I think the idea of the 5 work groups set up against the 5 sets of criteria that we have is a really good idea. I like that. I like the idea of having the commissioners be, each commissioner take one. This is now presumptively, this is not definite, but maybe even have the commissioners chair the work groups, and have the commissioners have the administrative responsibility for each work group, and then figure out for each work group where we need outside help. Realizing, as you said, we've got public agencies, we've got hired consultants, we've got our own consultants that are already on board. You know, amongst all the various resources that we've got, figure out who's going to need what for which work group, and then push. I like that as an operating presumption, and then fitting that into a time frame. So let's do. I think on the RFPs, just in the interest of time, they don't have to be perfect in terms of exactly what we need. And it seems to me that maybe we ought to authorize Commissioner Stebbins or maybe Director Day to start to go ahead and release one or more RFPs for the areas where we're pretty sure we're going to need help. I mean, they can be fairly broadly written. We know the kinds of firms we're going to be talking to. And if it turns out we don't use them, that doesn't matter, but we at least get the process going. So certainly on the financial services and maybe on the site design, the two that Commissioner Stebbins said are pretty well teed up, and any place else. If you can move those RFPs during the next 2 weeks prior to the 16th, I think that's all to the good.
I would agree with that, and it's actually some of the advice that we're giving to surrounding communities, that they should prep for the
Right.
potential
Exactly.
of needing some advisors. They can just keep them or engage them at any time after conducting the RFP. I would emphasize the second one. It seems like there's a lot of agreement relative to a financial advisor. That's perhaps a very intense and unique discipline. The second one, the second category, as Commissioner Stebbins highlights, is one that I would suggest we follow a similar approach like we did for the research, that we write it broadly, that we invite multiple disciplines that come from, that could fall under the criteria of site development, building, environmental assessments, etc. Architects, engineers, and that we invite firms and individuals to identify whether they would be responding to one or more or all of the of the broad categories within that RFP, and we see what we get. We may get firms that team amongst themselves because they could offer more of a comprehensive approach, or we could get individuals that say, I'm particularly interested in providing a narrow discipline, narrow expertise, let's say, and then we can make decisions after we see these responses.
Yeah. So do we need a vote to authorize the executive director? I don't think we do, to go ahead and put out RFPs if you're ready. So any time, just by consensus, anything that's ready to go, let's move it, just in the interest of time. And there is, apropos of what the Commissioner Zuniga said about using our own advice that we're giving to surrounding communities, there is a list of contractors, engineers, architects, et cetera, that DHCD publishes. Ombudsman Ziemba knows the exact number. We've got it around, but that's already procured. They're all pre-qualified. So there may well be, and I hope there are, and if there are, we ought to try to use that list, because we're recommending that the surrounding communities use that list rather than doing a de novo RFP process. So before maybe Commissioner Stebbins, if you're part of this conversation too, we're looking at that list, and maybe we can pull people off that list for some of our functional needs rather than having to do a whole new RFP. It'd also be good to familiarize ourselves with who's on that list. Two other observations. One is just to keep in the backs of our minds as we structure this process, remembering now that this is going to take place post-applications. So post, August for Category 2? Is that when we've got the deadline? What's our deadline for Category 2? Can't remember. October, okay. Yeah, and November or December for Category 1. But as soon as we make those awards, bang, we'll be operating, and the organization's going to have to do a 180 to start operating, all the things that we have to do to get ready to do our regulatory role and the supervision of the ramping up during the construction phase and everything else. So and you and I have talked about this in other contexts, but you and your staff are going to have your hands full getting ready for the day after the awards are given. And we need to make and we still don't have a chart yet that shows what needs to happen between that date and, or starting that date, from that to the time the facility's open. So just as we're making these assignments, we need to remember that you and your staff are going to have a lot of stuff going on to get ready to take the next phase. So we just can't look at this in a vacuum. We got to remember, what else is going to be on your plate. The last thing is we've moved around and around this issue of waiting or not, or the kind of waiting, and it was clear from the the report that Commissioner McHugh and Stebbins gave us, that in the people they've talked to, it's not standard operating procedure to have a numerical kind of weighting process. I know at least Commissioner Zuniga has had some strong feelings about that, and I don't really know what Commissioners McHugh and Stebbins would say, how they would rank these 5 different categories or various factors within these 5 different categories. So my question is, where is that decision? Is that also going to get all teed up? Is that going to be part of the proposal that you're going to give to us for the 16th? Does that need to be talked about now? Where is that in the process? Anybody?
Chairman Crosby, we definitely would, at least I see covering that as we get into the proposal for May 16th. But it would be helpful to me, because even as I read the memorandum, there was the use it referred to a scoring system, sort of an informal process that helped people kind of make decisions on what was stronger or weaker. So there is a possibility of using it in another fashion rather than scoring at the end result, but it may help when you're dealing with the detail in the middle. And so I know that there are, I know Commissioner Zuniga has mentioned scoring systems a lot. I have experience with scoring systems, but on the other hand, there may be some possible utilization that would serve a very specific purpose as we move forward. But I would benefit from any comment from the commissioners as if they had a preference or a consideration
Okay.
one way or the other.
Well, let's start out with Commissioners McHugh and Stebbins. If you have anything to say based on the work you've done, so you're sort of carrying the ball on this, and then see what others have to say.
The thing that struck me was that two things, I guess, struck me about the RFPs and the process that was used to evaluate them. The first thing about the RFPs was that there never in any of them was a specific weight assigned to the criteria. And the criteria were not simple and easily divisible into financial and design. The RFPs that we were provided are there in the shared drive. They're available to everybody. They're as complex in some areas as I think ours will wind up being. But in each case, the issuing authority reserved the right to did not assign a weight to them, although it did. A couple of them did list the criteria in relative order of importance without assigning a specific weight to them. And each one of the people to whom we talked said that that was designed to allow maximum flexibility in the evaluation process, while at least giving people an idea, a rough idea, as to how they at the outset, how the issuing authority viewed the importance of the criteria. In terms of scoring systems, it seems to me it's worthwhile to rank comparatively the various components of the responses, but everybody save one, that was Massport, said that a numerical ranking system really was not helpful. And the Massport approach, I'd be happy to expand on it in some other fashion. But so it strikes me, based on what we've seen in other surveys that we've done in these discussions here, that a comparative system rather than a numerical system with pre-assigned criteria is by far a better way to go to assure that we get maximum value for the Commonwealth.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I think in some ways, and I'm glad we're getting to the nuanced differences between ranking and scoring, which I think is important. I have expressed my comfort and experience with scoring systems. I'm not necessarily wedded to one here, especially in the context of multiple and complex criteria, sometimes going against each other. But I think that there's, as I've said before, I guess, if we do nothing in terms of weighing, or so at least some people, maybe not everybody, may interpret our 5 categories with 5 working groups to be weighted the same, to be weighted at 20%. And who could fault them from that? We could make that very explicit, that it's not necessarily the case. But I have some opinions as to those different buckets, and I'll give you one right now. The mitigation piece, in my view, is a process that happens before they get to this commission. There's a local process, there's a host community agreement and a series of surrounding community agreements, potentially, that are going to take care of, at least we hope, mitigation issues. Whereas we have a slightly different role where we analyze the financial piece of it. And maybe I'm just talking from comfort in terms of that that discipline, but that's something that really resides, in my view, on this commission to be analyzed. So that's maybe a difference that elicits a different weighing, or maybe not, but that's, I believe, a fundamental difference in those 2 big buckets. Now I could go on into any one of the subcategories, but I guess you get the point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what we got to talk about, because I would sort of intuitively have said that I think the 5 are about the same. You know, I would say it's imprecise, but I could sort of see a process emerging by which our work groups, with active commissioner involvement as well as staff and consultants, does a ranking within the 5 criteria, within each criteria. In other words, you take all 3 Eastern Mass applicants, and the mitigation work group ranks them by how they met the mitigation criteria. And then you put those 5 rankings together, and you will start to see a pattern. And that is a weighting, and that's a metric. You know, this is all just semantics to a certain extent. That is a metric. But I can see that as being kind of a logical process, and that for the more or less, the 5 are the same. And if somebody comes out on top in 3 of the 5, then that's getting you pretty close to a decision.
But Mr. Chairman, I don't think it's semantics. I agree with that approach. That's the approach that I favor. And I don't agree with that it's just semantic, because it seems to me that you can go through that kind of a comparative evaluation process and see one category, which if assigned a 20% weight would only have 20%, but it is so far better than everybody else's proposal and adds so much value to the project that, however they have started out with thinking that all these were approximately equal, you become convinced by looking at it that this is a dominant consideration. And we ought to preserve the flexibility to do that by not saying that we're going to assign a specific amount of weight. At least that's the way I'd look at it. And allow the comparative ranking and the possibility of somebody's proposal in one of those areas being so far ahead of everything else, or everything that we conceived of, that it really pushes that one to the top. I don't know that that'll happen, but it seems to me we ought to preserve the flexibility to allow it to, if it does.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you were disagreeing or agreeing or adding to but I completely agree with that. You might, in that process that I'm thinking about, that, you might rank, somebody might be number 2 on 4 things, but just barely number 2, and number 1 on the other one by such a distance that carries the day. So we wouldn't be locked into, all right, if you're number 1 on 3, you win automatically. If you were number 1 on 3, that's pretty telltale. That's pretty significant, but it's not dispositive, because there's left that subjective evaluation about how the other 2 rank versus your 3 first place finishes. So that as an evolving process, that sort of starts to sound reasonable to me. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, then that lends itself to, do you really want to say 1, 2, 3, or do you want to have categories like, excellent,
Maybe.
as opposed to number 1? Whatever, and then
Yeah.
really some detailed information in that category. I think just a strict number is sometimes hard to articulate. How are you number 1 over number 2? Where if you have detail in a category, whatever that is, it's easier to articulate and to justify.
You could make it excellent, very good,
Yeah,
acceptable,
whatever,
as opposed to
yes,
1, 2, 3, and you
correct.
count the number of excellents you have, and that creates a presumption.
I view those as very similar, but I
Yeah.
understand the difference. One thought I had, ultimately, and this may just be the nature of what we have to deal with, we may be in a scenario where one of us likes an applicant because of the great or superb job that they do on criteria 1, and one of us likes another applicant because of the superb job that they do on criteria 2. And whether that comes from the recommendations of the subgroups and the commissioners, or ultimately really discussed at this commission, we may end up, and that's just maybe the nature of this process, with a split vote, let's say. Somebody saying, Mr. Chairman saying, who moves to accept one versus another. Maybe that's just the nature of what we have. I guess as I'm thinking through it, that's something that just
Well, and the other
end up
piece
happening.
of that is, do you, at some point say, okay, here are 4, which 2 of our groups of licenses, that's the case, there are 4 applicants. Do you say, okay, these 2 are the top, and then you start a secondary process and comparing just those 2? Is something else to consider?
Yeah, well, we do have that flexibility currently with our with the regs as drafted.
Yes, but
But yeah, is that something that we know a priori that will be a process that we really intend to use, or reserve the right to use?
As a practical matter, I think the system we were talking about, either if we did a ranking 1, 2, 3, or if we just did excellent, very good, acceptable, if somebody fell out at the bottom, you'd know it, they'd be gone. I mean, so as a practical matter, I think the process we just talked about would do that. You would see somebody that just wasn't in the game, and all of our attention would then focus to whoever was still in the game.
unless they're very close, it's.
Well, then you wouldn't kick one out. If they were very close, you probably wouldn't kick one out because they were just this much below. But anyway, I think these all sort of get us to the same place. I certainly would think, as chair, I'll do everything that I can to have us have unanimous decisions. I think it would be better if we could have unanimous decisions, but that's certainly, I don't see why that's not locked in stone. If it turns out we disagree, we disagree. That's life. Well, this has been helpful for me, and this is beginning to give me a sense. And it sounds like we're not all in very different places about how this might start to evolve into a ranking, decision-making, weighting, whatever word you call it, process. So that was helpful. Anybody else want to add more to this? Okay. Where are we?
That concludes my report.
Geez, is that all?
Getting longer.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah, we do, I'm sorry. Let's do that. We are going to move our racing director. Are you sure? Okay. Totally? Okay. Then we'll stick with our schedule as it stands. Let me just make sure I haven't forgotten anything here. Okay. All right, let's go to item number 5, the Ombudsman report. Ombudsman Ziemba is in Marlborough. Speak closely to the mic, please, and you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I thought I'd do today is give you a little bit of an update of where we stand with the RPA process, the meetings that are ongoing out in the communities with the RPAs. As a reminder, we asked each of the different applicants on whether or not they wanted to participate in the RPA process. Initially, we asked all of the 9 that had designated sites on whether or not they wanted to participate in the process. And over the last couple of weeks, we've asked the remaining 2 on whether or not they want to participate in the process. So in the answer, the 3 answers that they could give would be that yes, they are interested in participating in the process and they'll attend a planning scoping meeting. They have not determined whether or not they're interested, but they'd attend a scoping meeting. And the 3rd category is that they're not interested in participating. We had no one indicate that they are not interested in participating, but I'll give you a little bit more of a flavor of where each of the applicants stands here. Crossroads, they have indicated that they are interested in utilizing the services of the RPA. And in the next couple of weeks, we are scheduled to have that meeting between the RPA, the host community, us, and the applicant. Hard Rock, they indicated that they haven't determined whether or not they're interested, but they are moving forward with the scoping meeting. We recently had a date, but unfortunately, one of the 4 parties couldn't make it at the later moments. But they have already begun working with PVPC on an initial basis. So even though this has not yet determined, they're already starting to work with PVPC. Mass gaming and entertainment, I think it's fair to say that they have not determined yet whether or not they'll utilize the services of an RPA.
Which one is that?
Hopefully they'll get back to us. We've been in contact with the city of Worcester. The city of Worcester has indicated that they are interested in utilizing this process, assuming that the applicant moves forward and voluntarily wants to participate. MGM, they indicated that they will participate in the process, and unfortunately, we're still waiting on a date. I believe that, as you know, they just entered into a host community agreement with the city of Springfield, and that took a tremendous amount of resources, staff resources, and time to get that together. So the scheduling of the date for the surrounding community scoping meeting has not yet occurred, but we're hoping to get that very soon. As I reported at our last meeting, we have already had the meeting with Mohegan Sun. That was an excellent meeting between the 4 parties, and we're starting to move forward on planning the next steps. Penn National, no date has been scheduled due to the recent decision by the city of Springfield. Plain Ridge, we recently had the initial scoping meeting. That was also a very good meeting, and we're starting to plan the next stages when, at least initially, the commission would come out and explain to some of the locals, the surrounding communities, potential surrounding communities, what the surrounding community process is, what the Gaming Act is, and I would go down there and explain that to a gathering of communities. PPE Casino, Cordish Resorts, they have not yet determined whether or not they're interested in utilizing the services of an RPA. Raynham Park, they indicated that they are interested in participating, but we are still waiting on a date. I've had recent conversations with the community, and they're looking forward to that meeting. Sterling Suffolk Racecourse, they had not determined whether or not they're interested, but we are scheduling the meeting in the next week or so, in the next week and a half or so, with them, that initial scoping meeting between the communities and Sterling Suffolk. And then the final applicant is Win LLC, and they also have not determined whether or not they're interested, and I guess it would be fair to say it's uncertain whether or not they will need to utilize the services of an RPA. I think that's a quick report, but that's what I was planning to give to the commission today.
Can you hear us all right?
I can.
Okay. When you said about Win, you said there's some question as to whether they will need to use the RPA. Did you mean that they will choose to use?
Yeah, I was. I don't think it was probably fair to use those two words interchangeably. Obviously, it's a voluntary process.
Okay.
If they choose to participate, they can do so. If they choose not to participate, they don't have to participate. I think in the past that there's been conversations about whether or not the use of an RPA would be necessary for them to successfully reach out to surrounding communities. So I probably shouldn't have said the word need. I should have said the word choose.
Okay. And then when you were talking about the Mohegan meeting, I think you referred to the 4 parties. Who was that?
So the four parties to all of these scoping meetings are the host community, the applicant, the gaming commission, and then the RPA.
The RPA. Okay, great. Got it.
So a part of the difficulty in getting these meetings is it's tremendously difficult to do 4-party scheduling where each one of the parties, except for us, has sub-entities that go to the meetings. I want to thank Mary Thurlow for sticking to it and trying to get all those scheduled.
Okay, great. I have a question, but does anybody else want to react to the Ombudsman's report thus far? An emerging issue that one sees reading all the different comments, and that you're certainly familiar with, John, is the nature of the review of mitigation, of impacts that will be done by surrounding communities. It seems to me, I think, if I understand you correctly, that you're thinking that the primary work will be done either at the behest of the applicant in its basically having to do with its host community work, but just because it'll be in the nature of their need for purposes of our applications to do impact assessments around them. Included in that, since it's also at the behest of MIPA, or at the behest of the applicant, there'll be a MIPA process, which will necessarily have a pretty comprehensive assessment of impacts on the entire region. And it seems to me that you're not anticipating, for the very most part, that there would be individual contracts done on a surrounding community by surrounding community basis of the impacts on them. That what we would mostly be doing is a peer review of that other work, MIPA and other work, that would be done by somebody to make sure that the surrounding community's interests were sufficiently attended to. That's clearly not what some of the surrounding communities are thinking. And I'm just wondering where you are on this. How are you thinking about approaching this? How much more do we, the commission, need to talk about it, et cetera?
Well, I think my understanding of this matter comes from all of my conversations with the regional planning agencies in developing the RPA process. And we took a look at the stores of data that will be available to take a look at in determining impacts. And so primarily it is the applicant's responsibility to put together numerous studies that will eventually be sent to the commission. But those studies are also utilized in the process of determining what a good host community agreement is. It's very likely that in most, if not all, host communities, there'll be a very, very substantial and robust review of those same impacts conducted by some likely third party of what those impacts would be. So in the process of developing the RPA process, the collective belief that we had during that process would be that there would be very substantial stores of data between both the applicant's data and then the host community data that could then be in turn reviewed by a third party, basically a peer review. For surrounding communities, it is very understandable. We would not want to rely specifically upon the information that is provided solely by a developer. And I'm not saying that our applicants are any different from any developer of any different type of project. It's just a typical concern of either host communities or in our world, surrounding communities, that you want to make sure that you can verify those impacts. So primarily, I think that we were thinking that the RPAs, specifically in our matter, would be utilized to do peer reviews. But if indeed something has not occurred, whereas a report of a particular type of impact has not occurred, it could very well require an additional independent study. But because there will be multiple data sources, and they'll review, and then we'll also have the benefit of at least a couple of independent firms. It is our hope that with the expertise that would be provided by the RPAs, that we could get a very true understanding of what those impacts are. Now that, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that may be very different from what some surrounding communities may contemplate. They may contemplate that they would only want to do their own independent study, and they would not rely upon either the data from the host community or the applicant. And I think that would have to be a discussion. Indeed, if there was ever a petition for involuntary disbursements, I think that there would have to be a discussion of why a sole independent study would be necessary, rather than relying on the specific data sources that have been commissioned to date. Perhaps a surrounding community could say, hey, this particular report that was done by applicant X or host community Y is not very robust. The firm doesn't have the experience that we think is necessary to review these potential impacts. A case could be made of why an independent study would be necessary instead of a peer review. But I think by default, all of these studies do cost a substantial amount of money, and at least in my thinking, every dollar that you are spending on a study, albeit necessary, may take away from it a dollar that actually could be spent on mitigation. So if you can find a way to efficiently get to a result in analyzing what the actual impacts are, that frees up hopefully some dollars that could be spent on actual mitigation of those impacts.
I think we know that there are a bunch of surrounding communities that are already teed up to be clear that no amount of applicant-funded research is going to be enough. But I think maybe we need to set expectations. We're going to have to be the arbiter of this, right? If surrounding community A says that it needs an independent study of something or other, and we don't think it does, then we're going to be the arbiter of that, right?
That's right.
So, and we're pretty clearly predisposed, and I'm going this, I think the same way you do about this, but I just wanted to have you articulate your thought process for all of us. I lean the same way. It seems to me that in the normal development process, that these kinds of studies are done. These are big projects, but it's not like there haven't been other great big projects that are similar to these. That the standards for what's required, the standard of rigor is a known standard. You can't write it on a piece of paper very well, but it's a well-known standard. And we probably need to do something to set the expectations of the surrounding communities sooner than later, that there's going to be a very strong presumption that the applicant-driven research is going to be the research that we'll rely on. Because I know a lot of people are getting teed up to do something quite different from that. And we might as well.
I guess
Go ahead.
Guess I would just put a little footnote on that. I think the thought was that between at least the applicant and the host community, which will also be hiring independent
Right.
outside advisors, that between those two sources of data, that potentially we can ascertain the reality of that data. And especially with the RPA process, I feel fairly confident that the RPAs, with their expertise, will be able to take a look at the various reports that have been done by these professional teams and be able to, poke holes in them if there are holes, and to be able to say, we need more data on this, we need a further study on this, and then they can take a look at it. And, potentially if a potential surrounding community wants to use its own team rather than the RPA, they could do basically the same thing. Their own independent advisor could take a look at those stores of information and say, this is going to work, this is not going to work, we want a lot more detail here. So potentially you could have a situation where it's not a one-shot determination by the commission, where if the commission says, hey, we agree with the following technical assistance, potentially that may or may not work over time. So there might be, further need for the applicants and the potential surrounding communities to work within whatever confines we come up with in the involuntary disbursements process. But I'm under no illusion that an involuntary disbursements process will be satisfactory to anyone. It's unlikely to be satisfactory to the applicant. It's probably not going to be fully satisfactory to the potential surrounding community. So that is why we are very much encouraging applicants to reach out to potential surrounding communities and iron out these issues that take time to really determine what is necessary, rather than a day hearing before the commission. It's just a difficult process that is hopefully going to be avoided through conversations between the applicants and the potential surrounding communities.
In the written application, in the written comments on the regs, both bidders and surrounding communities have complained about our involuntary process, so it must be right.
Yeah, I think maybe while not desirable, I think that involuntary disbursement is key to addressing the potential for an impasse that could happen. And I think you've thought it well within the confines of the RPA process.
I agree with that. It seems to me that we ought to set expectations, and the expectation ought to be that it is, the default is, as for all the reasons John has articulated, a peer review. And if somebody can demonstrate to us why that's insufficient, we'll listen and make any decision that's necessary. But particularly with the RPAs, who are there to serve all the towns and communities in the region involved in the process, it seems to me the integrity of the outcome can be assured.
If we don't, even in a region, even for an applicant where the RPA process is not being used, we could still use the RPAs to tell us whether or not they think that the work that's been done is sufficient, right? I mean, we don't have the expertise to make that judgment ourselves. So would you expect that even in a community where the RPA process isn't used, that if there's an impasse between a potential surrounding community and a bidder, that we would use the RPAs for their judgment about that?
RPAs certainly have the expertise to provide us. My only concern is if they are involved in a process that is sort of outside of, excuse me, for lack of a better word, adjudicatory process before us, a decision process before us, on whether or not that would not provide a legal conflict, but whether or not the parties would see RPAs being involved in a decision-making process over on through the commission as contrary to the sort of team-building process that would be involved in its evaluation. I think it was meant that the RPAs would try to get the applicants and the potential surrounding communities together at a table to have a very productive dialogue so that they could, come to an understanding of what the actual numbers are, what the actual impacts are, and then you can have the conversation about the mitigation. I'm just worried that if we pull RPAs out of that collegial process to be involved in our process, which will obviously be a very contentious process, whether or not that hurts their ability to work with those parties to hopefully work things out. So that's the one worry that I have, and I don't think it rises to a legal conflict or a state ethics conflict or anything of the like. But I have a little bit of discomfort in that.
But does that rule out the possibility that even if the applicant or the surrounding community or both have not agreed to the RPA process, but we get a request for an independent study as opposed to some kind of a peer review, we could go to the RPA and say, make an effort to get these people together, have them make that effort, and if they can't, then take that into account in making a decision as to whether or not we're going to require an involuntary payment for an independent study.
I think that makes a lot of sense. But in that instance that you just described, both parties are not part of this collegial process. I think that's a much easier question to answer. The question of whether or not, if they're involved in a process and it's a smaller matter, whether or not we could use their services, which would be invaluable to us. I think that's harder of a question, but I wouldn't want to say that we couldn't use that. But I just feel a little bit reluctant for the reasons that I mentioned. But Commissioner McHugh, in the instance that you just described, where they both have voluntarily said that they won't participate, that could be very useful for us to use the services of the RPAs.
That's the case I was talking about. That was the case I was talking about.
Okay.
All right.
I think I was describing a situation where a community then applies to us for an involuntary disbursement, but there's participation by numerous communities with an applicant trying to work things out. That gets a little bit more thorny.
Right. Well, I know this isn't easy, sitting where you sit, but I do think it's important as we are communicating with surrounding communities and bidders, that this is going to be the process. That we're really talking about a fairly strong presumption here. It's a rebuttable presumption, and will be reasonable, but it's a pretty strong presumption, and that should affect particularly the surrounding communities, but bidders as well, on how they talk with one another about doing this in a collaborative way. And the stronger we are, the clearer we are on the point, on the presumptive nature of this use of peer review as opposed to original research, I think the better it'll be in the long run. Are you all right?
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, there's matters of timing. If an applicant doesn't have studies available, a surrounding community would be in no other position but to move forward on their own study.
Right.
So, again, we're encouraging applicants to get those studies done as quickly as possible and have those available to communities to evaluate true impacts.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything? All right, let's have a quick break, and then we'll come back in very few minutes and do legal. Okay? All right, we are reconvening public meeting number 66, and we have our general counsel.
The commission is.
Bring the phone up close to your mic, close to your mouth.
The legal department is here today on two matters. The first is a conversation with Mr. Grossman about referendum spending limits, and Mr. Grossman is in Fall River.
All right, Attorney Grossman.
Okay. Good morning.
Good
I was asked
afternoon.
to take a look at whether the commission
Speak into the mic
is able to
closely, Todd.
Sure. I was asked to take a look at whether the commission is able to set a spending cap or a limit on the amount of money that an applicant over here. Try that again. Okay. asked to take a look at as to whether the commission could set a limit on the amount that applicants could spend in advocating for a positive vote in the host community election. And what I found was that there are no present restrictions in the general laws or in the regulations promulgated by the Office of Campaign and Political Finance that set such limits. And the reason for it seems to be that all of the cases, whether it's the Supreme Court or the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, seem to counsel against setting such a limit on constitutional grounds. And without getting into a whole constitutional law discussion and the distinction between the U.S. Constitution and the Massachusetts State Constitution and the Declaration of Rights, I would just suggest that there are a number of cases that the Supreme Court has handed down that suggest, or state, in my opinion, fairly clearly, that imposition of such a cap or any type of restriction on such spending relative to a ballot question versus the election of a candidate would be an infringement of liberties afforded under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And I'll get into all of these type issues individually. I would just say, though, that the reason why I say that the court has the case is counsel against doing that as opposed to definitively saying that you can't do it is that the court has left the door open in one very limited circumstance, which I'll get to towards the end. But before we get there, I just wanted to, if the commission will indulge me for a moment, I thought I would just read some of the language that the Supreme Court has included in its decisions that I think more clearly articulate the law in a way that better than I could do it myself. So I would just first quote from the First National Bank of Boston case. That was actually a case that involved a Massachusetts statute. It was a 1978 case, and the court there said that referenda are held on issues, not candidates for public office. The risk of corruption perceived in cases involving candidate elections simply is not present in a popular vote on a public issue. To be sure, corporate advertising may influence the outcome of the vote. This would be its purpose. But the fact that advocacy may persuade the electorate is hardly a reason to suppress it. The Constitution protects expression which is eloquent no less than that which is unconvincing. We noted only recently that the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. Moreover, the people in our democracy are entrusted with the responsibility for judging and evaluating the relative merits of conflicting arguments. They may consider, in making their judgment, the source and credibility of the advocate. But if there be any danger that the people cannot evaluate the information and arguments advanced by the appellants, it is a danger contemplated by the framers of the First Amendment. So that's just one of the passages that the court used to outline what the problem is with trying to set a limit on spending when it comes to ballot questions. And that is to be distinguished against spending in elections, in which most of us are probably aware caps are set, in that individuals can only contribute certain amounts towards candidates and thus. And the reason for that was also articulated by the Supreme Court when it said that the reason it sets that exception is that to the extent that large contributions are given to secure a political quid pro quo from current and potential office holders, the integrity of our system of representative democracy is undermined. And what the court has basically said is that that consideration is not present when it comes to a ballot question versus the election of a candidate. So the exception that allows, or the court has suggested, allows for certain arguable infringements of the First Amendment are not applicable when it comes to a ballot question. In order to abridge any constitutional protection, the state generally has to have some type of compelling interest. So the reason that I was asked to study this issue is that it has been suggested that the applicants are more fully funded, more able to sway a vote potentially than any opposition groups who would arguably be largely underfunded. And the result of that may be a skewed result of the election. So in an effort to try to prevent that from happening, it was suggested perhaps that a cap be set on the amount that an applicant could spend on that type of vote. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court has suggested can't be done. And it described the state interest in doing so, in setting a cap in this manner. It said that whatever may be the state interest or degree of that interest in regulating and limiting contributions to or expenditures of a candidate or a candidate's committees, there is no significant state or public interest in curtailing debate and discussion of a ballot measure. Placing limits on contributions, which in turn limit expenditures, plainly impairs freedom of expression. The integrity of the political system will be adequately protected if contributors are identified in a public filing revealing the amounts contributed. And indeed, in Massachusetts, of course, there are disclosure requirements, particularly when it comes to these types of elections, that any contributors or the applicants will have to file. So it'll be clear how much was spent on these elections. In sum, I said the court left the door open in one instance. So if the commission were inclined to set a spending cap, I believe what it would have to do is establish a record on the facts that demonstrate a compelling interest in abridging or potentially abridging these rights. And what the court has essentially said is that you would have to demonstrate facts that would show that that such a cap would be justified essentially because corporations, or in this case applicants, wealthy and powerful, could undermine the democratic process by drowning out other points of view. In order to achieve something like that, likely we would need some type of study or expert testimony or something like that, which may be at this point incompatible with the approach the commission has taken in setting up the system of issuing a license, which is to attempt to avoid any pitfalls that could lead to litigation. And it seems to me that review of these cases, when read together, when distilled, the essence seems to be that setting any type of cap without establishment of a clear record explaining why the state's interest in doing so is so compelling would violate the First Amendment and potentially the Declaration of Rights in the Massachusetts state constitution. So my recommendation at this point would be that absent some compelling interest on the part of the commission, that we not seek to set a spending cap, and that the disclosure requirements should be satisfactory for these purposes.
Thank you, Todd. That was well done. Any commissioner reactions or anybody?
I agree with
I'm
the
sorry, we
recommendation.
can't hear you over here.
Oh, go ahead.
I agree with the recommendation. Attorney Grossman laid out the facts and the how the courts have already ruled, and it appears to me that that's a sound recommendation.
Anybody else?
Yep, I would agree with that. Thank you, Todd. It's very thoughtful and well-researched, and I would agree as well.
I think the Globe editorial, just I think for the record, did not call for a cap. I think the Globe editorial probably anticipated that there's a constitutional issue and talked about us. I recommended that we do things, try to figure out ways to discourage overspending or otherwise equalize the conversation, which we might be able to contort ourselves into something which wouldn't run afoul of this. But even though I think, I think that for what it's worth, which is nothing, the court's reasoning is specious, totally fails to understand, what does distort the democratic process. It's nevertheless, it's the law of the land, and it's probably not worth us opening that can of worms at this stage of the game. We've got enough cans of worms to deal with. So unless anybody, Commissioner Stebbins, do you have a view?
Yeah, a good report and review of the applicable cases, Todd.
Okay. Commissioner McHugh?
No, I fully agree, and I don't think the court, when it comes to referenda, is misapprehending anything. I think they got it exactly right when it comes to referenda. But that's neither here nor there either.
Right. We'll talk about it over lunch. All right, so I think, yeah.
Perhaps worthy of note is that what we've attempted to do by virtue of these hearings, and we'll be doing more of them, because we're also required, it gives an opportunity for everybody to express any kind of views.
Yeah.
They don't have to be limited.
Well, we were specifically talking about the referendum, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, yeah. I mean, that's a good point. We're certainly going out of our way to make sure everybody has an equal opportunity to communicate. Okay, thank you very much, Legal Department. Let's move on.
The final matter that I have before you today is to ask for you to approve the appointment of David Murray as a hearing officer on behalf of the Commission, and delegate to him the necessary authority to hear matters that would come before the Commission under its regulations for hearing. Mr. Murray has been with us for a little while, helping us with racing matters, and he has expertise certainly in the racing area and will be very able to take on this responsibility. He will be with us on a part-time basis as we assess the need for hearing officers as we move forward. Mr. Murray can't be with us here today, but he did ask me to convey to you the fact that he is delighted to serve in this role and is very much looking forward to taking this on. So if you could approve his appointment and delegate the necessary responsibility, that would be great.
Any discussion?
Yes, I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Murray in my oversight role for racing. I thought he did an excellent job. He listens, he understands the issues, and I think he'd be a fine choice in that matter.
We have a motion or comment?
Can I just ask a question? Is there a term for this appointment? I guess I'll just put a question mark there.
We would need to amend his current contract. I propose amending it for a year to get us through at least the next racing season and perhaps into some of the gaming licensing if we need him, and then we would review it from there.
Okay, Commissioner?
Yes, I understand the answer. Thank you.
Somebody want to move?
Sure, I move that we accept the recommendation as put forward and appoint Dave Murray as the hearing officer for the racing division.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor, please? No, so we have to go around. Commissioner Stebbins?
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh?
Yes.
Commissioner Zuniga?
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron?
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Dernberger?
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I really don't have much of an administrative update today, so we'll just kind of breeze into the two orders of business that appear on the agenda. One is that we are in possession of the 2011 annual report of the old Massachusetts State Racing Commission that has come to us, and it's a rather awkward situation in that none of the commissioners were seated at any point during the period of time that this report covers, which was calendar year 2011. It has gone up through the agencies and come back to us, and so we would recommend that you approve our filing of the report on behalf of the now defunct Massachusetts State Racing Commission.
Do we need a motion for this? We do. Any discussion, or go ahead?
No discussion. I was just going to make the motion that we accept the report and accept the filing of the report.
Second?
Second.
Any thoughts? Commissioner McHugh, you look like you're about to say something.
I just, are we making it clear in this motion that we're not, in this process, that we're not,
Yes.
that we're not necessarily adopting or making any judgment about the accuracy of the content of the report, or conversely, are we making a judgment about the accuracy of the content?
We actually talked about this in your absence, and it's very clear on the report, it's very clear on the record that we are merely approving its submission, and we're taking no position whatsoever on its content. And that's,
Could we make that part of the motion so it's clear on the ultimate vote?
sure.
In other words, that we accept the report for filing without making any judgment on its content.
Is that
Would that work?
okay to amend your
Yes,
motion?
I amend the motion stating same, that we accept the report for filing and had no control, nor do we have any judgment on the content.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor, Commissioner Stebbins?
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh?
Yes.
Commissioner Zuniga?
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron?
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. Thank you.
Okay, we will file that. And the second order of business for the racing division is the approval of special events to be simulcast at Raynham Park for 2013. Our live racing licensees, as part of their application process, apply for these special events where they are able to simulcast interstate horse races and do so in a premium-free capacity. So in other words, at any time they're broadcasting a signal, they have to pay, if they're a running horse racing meeting licensee, they have to pay the harness horse premium and vice versa. So there are in 128C Section 2 Provision 3 that does permit the offering of simulcast wagering on 15 running horse special events without having to pay the premium. That provision applies to Raynham Park, and they recently submitted a list to us of their 15 special events for 2013. They are as follows. This Saturday's Kentucky Derby. In 2 weeks, the Preakness Stakes. 3 weeks after that, the Belmont Stakes, otherwise known in whole as the Triple Crown. And 12 Breeders' Cup races, which are offered over the course of 2 days in November. And my recommendation is that these special events do be approved.
Is there anything controversial about this? I mean, I gather this is something that's been going on forever. The letter from Raynham does not ask our permission. It doesn't request. It informs us that it is taking those days. I don't know whether they have the right to do it that way. Your cover memo says it's a request, but it's not in its language. Is this anything we ought to be thinking about, or is this just so routine that we ought to just let it go? It's fine.
Both. So it is routine. These are probably the 15 largest races, in terms of handle, the 15 largest races that they would simulcast during the year on the thoroughbred side. So that would make sense that those would be the special events that they would request to have as their premium free events. And I think it is a little bit addressed in our 128D, the proposed legislation that we put forth, which is that this structure of bringing in a signal, simulcasting it, paying a fee and then a premium, and then having exceptions to the premium. I think that's something that we addressed in 128D that we thought may deserve being looked at, and that was part of the elegance conversation that we had, that there
Right.
may be a better way. So
But for
both.
purposes of now,
I see no reason not to. As you say, the word inform appears here, but I do think that it's within our purview to approve. And
is this anything that at any later date, sort of imagine down the road, is there, is it important for us, for example, in doing so, to correct the impression, what may be random, I don't know what this is, I don't want to make too big a deal out of this, but, is there any precedent that we need to protect? Might we ever want to do anything differently about this on our own? In which case, we should make sure that this informs isn't right, that, this is a privilege, not a right, and we're subject to review every year or something like that? Or
for
is-
the live racing licensees, it actually is reviewed every year because it's part of their application process, which is on an annual basis. Raynham's in a unique position because of the
Right.
provision in the Acts of 2011
Right.
that essentially extended their simulcast license. So they're in a unique position. So we can certainly look at it. It's a limited window of time that this process is actually going to be in effect, but we'll certainly revisit it. And
So is this the one that this lapses? Oh, this lapses next year. That's right, yeah, okay.
But happy to revisit it and come back to you.
Okay. Well, I don't want to create make work. I mean, if it's not a big deal, but up to you. Other comments, commissioners? Okay. Do we need a motion? Yes. Somebody? Commissioner?
I move that we accept the advisement of Raynham Park that the 15 races included are approved.
Or that we accept the recommendation of the director to approve the request of Raynham? Is that all right?
Okay, so we will accept the recommendation of the director to approve the advisement of Raynham
Okay.
Taunton
Second?
Park.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Commissioner Stebbins?
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh?
Yes.
Commissioner Zuniga?
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron?
Yes?
And the chair votes yes.
And that would conclude the Racing Division's report unless you have any other items of business you'd like to speak about.
Thank you, Director.
Oh, great. Any exciting business going on at Suffolk Downs for the opening day?
We're working on it.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, we are now to the research agenda. Let's do this in two parts. I'll just give a few notes on the meeting. Since Commissioner McHugh and Commissioner Cameron were not here, we didn't spend a lot of time summarizing the day that Commissioner Zuniga and I spent with our research team, where they had an organizational meeting with almost all of their key players together in Amherst, and we spent the day there and actually went to dinner with them as well. First of all, it's just important for you to know that it's underway. I mean, they're moving. We haven't fully and technically consummated an agreement yet, but we have told them that we are anticipating going forward and that they can go ahead and accrue expenses against in effect, an April 1 start date, which will eventually be incorporated into our contract. They will be coming here on the 16th, another item for our 16th agenda, and give a PowerPoint presentation about the theoretical framework of the study, which Commissioner Zuniga and I thought was really interesting, and all the commissioners and the public would be interested in seeing. And while they're here, they'll also give us, Rachel Volberg will give us a status report on the research project. There were a few notes of interest. We talked quite a bit about whether our regs had enough attention paid to making sure that the operators know what their what their requirements will be to give us the information that we need to do our research, fulfill our research mandate. And the Chapter 97 and 91, I think, the 71, yeah, 97 and 71 that talked about the research, and we've asked the legal department to look at that and make sure that our regs give a heads up, because we're asking for quite a bit of information, anonymous, but nevertheless information from the bidders, and we want to make sure that people are aware of that early on. We talked about the need to coordinate with the Department of Public Health, the State Department of Public Health, and we are in fact moving forward on that. Actually, today, the PI, the principal investigator on the research project, is meeting with senior people at the Department of Public Health to get that relationship built. We talked about whether there were any conflict of interest rules or our ethics rules, and we decided that there were, that they would have to comply. They are, whatever the word is, special state employees, and that we were going to be sure to get the appropriate ethics rules out to them that they know they need to comply with. One thing I did mention last week that was shocking to hear, Commissioner McHugh and Commissioner Cameron, the co-PI on this project is Rob Williams. Williams? Yes. Right. From Canada, who's the head of the problem gambling research arm in Canada. And they've done research on problem gambling recently that that got data that 50% of the revenue generated in the Alberta casino or casinos comes from 2.5% of the gamblers who are the problem gamblers. 50% of the revenue from 2.5% of the gamblers. And that was Alberta, and there was another one in Montreal, Toronto? Ontario.
It was 30%.
That was 30%. So it's just, as we discussed last week, that's not necessarily indicative of anything other than what the problem gambling situation is in those two communities. But still, it's a very sobering issue and sobering facts. And we are going to be looking very, very hard, probably as hard as anybody's ever looked, at what the problem gambling issue will be in our communities once this gets started. Finally, we talked about making sure there's a close working relationship with Marlene Warner from the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling. And again, that relationship is a close one already, and they're working together. I think that's about it. They're setting up shop. They're going through, the research team was going through the same thing we went through, which is desperately trying to get organized in the early days without an office and without business cards and the whole bit. But UMass Amherst is providing them space, giving them an overhead structure. They're going to start next week, midweek. They'll have their first graduate student that will start to provide some staff help. So they're moving quickly, and they, as you heard before, they are tremendously excited about this project. Everybody involved with it on the research side really appreciates what a unique and unusual project this is. So that was the substance of it. If you want to add anything else, or go to the budget.
Sure, I can speak to the status of where we are in the contract and budget element of this. We received on May 1st, at the end of the day, really, so a little too late to be included in the packets for this meeting, the latest draft of the budget. So I can speak to it in general, and although all of this document resides in our shared drive, and I can make it, of course, it's all available for us. There are two elements that I want to highlight relative to how the budget progressed, if you will, from an initial cost proposal to where we stand right now, or today. And I'll speak to it now. I came to realize this was just something that happened to me personally, that the cost proposal as put forward in the response to the RFA, those costs were not necessarily going to be uniform throughout the period that they were proposing. We just said, give us an estimate for a 3 and a 6 year period. They gave us a few numbers with a lot of backup. But by its very nature, those costs happen to have they have to be front-loaded, and which is what I'll highlight in a few minutes. by design, those costs have to happen with some degree of intensity in the first year because of the baseline study, but also given our time frame for what we're projecting right now in terms of award of a license, prior to the third year, or the threshold that I highlighted, that we asked when we asked for a cost response. So much of the costs, as we see them, are, as I say, front-loaded. There's another element to it as well, which when we began negotiations with the team from Amherst, we noted that there were elements of the other team's response, the CHA TDM game team, that we found particularly insightful relative to a response rate. Their methodology and approach included additional steps that would ensure, and we agreed with this, a higher response rate. We asked, in terms of the survey as conducted, those include a couple of items like an online tool, also incentives, very small incentives for responses that ensures a higher response rate. And in a time of caller ID and cell phone use, that happens to be particularly important.
If I can just add to this, this was really interesting that apparently the less expensive, somewhat less expensive mechanism for getting interviews in our major baseline survey that was originally proposed was expected to get a response rate of about 10%. If we adopted these extra mechanisms for inducing higher responses, that would go up to around 25%. In the research world, there is a debate as to whether or not a 10% response rate gets you a legitimate enough number to protect, but no debate that a 25% response rate is a number that you can defend. That, by protect, I mean defend. We desperately need to have this data be bulletproof, because if we come up with anything, whatever it is that people don't like, they're going to attack our methodology. So we decided it was worth spending some extra money to get the research. I think it was only like $180,000 over the first period, whatever. First year, yeah. But whatever the number was, we decided to spend the extra money to get the response rate up so that we took away that potential vulnerability in our results.
Actually, along those lines, the number, once you factor in those two things we talked about, the incentives and an online tool as an additional tool for surveying, there's a third element that was also discussed when we went out there. It's called an online panel. There's survey groups that are now a lot more popular in the online world, groups that are put together to take any number of surveys. And this is just another group that we would use that costs money that is not originally contemplated. So these three, in general, these three additional steps have an incremental cost of $322,000.
A net, yeah.
A net incremental cost, which is something, again, that was not part of the proposal. But the biggest, as I mentioned, difference, if you will, in terms of what we will put forward right now, which is a 15-month budget, and just taking a face value cost proposal of what we got, 4.7 million for the first 3 years, and a total of cumulative of 10 million for the total 6 years, comes from the fact that these costs have to be front-loaded by the nature of what we're doing. So
and let me just reiterate one thing I said before. It's really important, that it was never anticipated that we would use this money, use our present loan from the rainy day fund to pay for our research project and research and problem gaming. That's meant to be paid for out of the Public Health Trust Fund, but as it turns out, we can't get money in the Public Health Trust Fund until after we've awarded licenses, which is too late to do the baseline research. Just an anomaly that the legislature didn't anticipate in the law. We can probably, I'll make the case that we can pay ourselves back once we get a public health trust fund. But in the short term, it creates this cash issue that we hadn't really anticipated.
Right, this cash concern. I think we can manage it, by the way. I will be coming back with more accurate projections, especially in the context of what we discussed earlier and the next fiscal year, and how we see some of the revenues and assessments coming to this commission in the next fiscal year. But yes. So what we have essentially is a 15-year budget.
15-month.
15-month, I'm sorry. Did I say year? That's a big difference.
Yeah.
A 15-month budget of $3,459,391 at this point that I would ask to be for consideration and discussion, of course, ultimately approval in terms of entering into an ISA, which is essentially a contract with the team from UMass to proceed with in full gear with the research project. So
Commissioner McHugh,
questions?
you look like you're about to speak.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Our last approach to this authorized Commissioner Zuniga to enter into negotiations with the team and then come back to us with a budget or a proposal in the context of a cash flow analysis that showed the impact of the payouts on our cash flow and our ability to support it. And that was a commission vote that took into account the expenditures we'd already made, but also the expenditures we were likely to make as we staffed up to deal with the coming evaluation process, the coming licensing process, and the addition of staff to the commission. What we have today is a proposal for for approval of an expenditure, but no analysis of a cash flow and the expenditure's impact on our cash flow. And I understand the anomaly. I also understand and fully embrace the importance of this study. But at the same time, I'm looking at the expenditures we're likely going to have to make over the next few months and year to get ourselves staffed up and operational. So I would be prepared to authorize, have the commission authorize, or I would like to talk about the commission authorizing this study to proceed under terms that would allow us to cut back on, reduce, postpone, whatever, spending, if and to the extent it's necessary for us to hire the personnel that we need and make the other expenditures that we need in order to get the licensing process moving forward on the schedules that we have agreed upon, and the schedules that are necessary to get us, to have us maintain in order to get the revenues that we need to fund the study, rather than have a unconditional approval of this approximately $3.5 million over the next 15 months. Hopefully we'll find a way to be able to afford it and we can go forward, but it seems to me that that expenditure, like all others, has to be considered in context. And so that's what I'd like to discuss for a minute, and then have Commissioner Zuniga come back promptly or in connection with the projection of a FY14 budget, so we can revisit this amount and how much we can afford to spend now on this critically important study.
to speak. Yeah, that's. I think that's a great an important point. I would mention that I believe that we have the ability to, at any point, postpone, defer, suspend, put on hold any number of activities within this current budget and the current contract. We could and will make it very explicit on one. But I will note that, of course, by its very nature, because of such breadth and scope, some of those activities, if you will be easier on certain costs compared to others. There are, by its very nature, there are some costs that are setup costs, others are fixed costs, and others are variable costs. And of course, the notion of coming back is a sound one, if we need to, and we would just have to consider with varying degrees of variability, if you will, expenditures that had already been incurred. If we decided, for example, that we needed to stop or suspend certain activities, but I believe fundamentally that we have the right to do that under the current standard terms and of the contracts of the Commonwealth contract form, because this is an ISA. We could make it more explicit, and we will, and we can have those discussions. Again, but there's to be nuanced. There's certain activities that, by its very nature, they need to be expended.
Right.
Well, I'm not certain that I understand that Commissioner, the part about there's certain activities that they need to engage in.
Well,
here's what I'm concerned about. If we make an unconditional commitment to this critically important study in isolation, without considering the context in which that commitment is made, then we basically create a fixed obligation around which we have to fold other potential expenditures. And it may be, and that's why I think when we talked about this last time, we talked about coming back with a cash flow analysis when we considered the amount. If we have a fixed expenditure, a fixed commitment, and then we have to mold other expenditures around that fixed commitment, we may well wind up being unable to afford at the time we need to afford, obtaining resources, whether they be consultants or permanent employees who are critical to moving the entire process forward, and then being able to realize the monies we need to fund this project. So it seems to me that whatever we do today ought to maintain the flexibility that I submit we need, the fiscal flexibility that I submit we need, and have us revisit where we are and how much we can afford when we get a more robust set of projections as to what our cash flow over the next 15 months will be, something that you are undoubtedly working on now.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about much of the same thing. I think, and I'm not asking, and I don't think we are suggesting that this be an unconditional approval, if you will, or commitment. Let me give you an example in the context of, let's say, a large construction project, which to a degree, this is what we're embarking on, a large project, one that includes some upfront costs, some mobilization costs, and if the owner, which is that's effectively our role of owners, decides to suspend or in its most dramatic aspects, stop all activities relative to that project, there will be some costs associated with demobilizing, for example. They just have to, they would have to agree with that. but we would have to consider some incremental cost as a small example. So if we were to decide, for example, to extend the period, to mothball certain activities, let's say, there would be additional costs to those activities, hopefully less than a burn rate of continuing the project in full. So I believe we have that authority and ability as the contracting party here. We can make that very explicit. But as I was just talking about costs, they will not necessarily disappear just because we wanted somebody to stop, even if we ask them to stop.
But just for the most part, they will. I mean,
Yes,
yes, any time you turn something off, sometimes you incur costs when you turn it off. So, but for the most part, if we wanted to put the brakes on performance management, research,
We can do that.
personal hires, we can do it, right? And this is not unconditional any more than any of the rest of our commitments are unconditional, except any which is governed by law. And so I think we're in agreement with you, Commissioner McHugh, and we agree that we need to come back with a real cash flow, not a back of the envelope job, which we've done sort of at the nearest million, and see how it looks. And then, as you well know, there's a lot of critical variables that we don't know to put into that. They're both expenses and incomes that we can't put into that cash flow, which is what leaves us in this uncertain position. But certainly for the next 6 to 9 months, maybe even 6 to 12 months, we're fine. That gives us plenty of time to look at the cash flow, and if we need to make contingency decisions, we've got time to make them. Anything else on this? So what we've done, just again to reiterate, we were expecting to do a 6-year contract, or at least a 3-year with a
contract
renewable,
first.
with a 3-year renewal option. But there are some, we haven't negotiated that financial deal yet. And in the interest of time, to make sure we get this up and going, albeit in a conditional way, we decided we'd just do a 15-month budget. That gets everybody going, that gets the paperwork started, and then, as soon as we can, within the probably next few weeks, we'll come back with the budget for the balance of the research term, and having scrubbed and reviewed those numbers, and have a second conversation about the full research project. So this is just a 15-month budget to get us going.
Right. Actually, I would argue we could come back much later when we have a lot more certainty
Yeah, true.
in
Good
terms
point,
of these provides. Let's not say 14 months from now. Let's say 6 months. Let's say halfway through this budget, we could come back with a lot more robust understanding of both future commitments and cash flow and revenues for the operating expenses.
Great.
Come back halfway through this budget?
No, in order to approve the next version of this effort.
So come back after we've spent $1.7 million?
Already time before we're done doing that.
Well, there's two different issues. One is we're going to be keeping a month-by-month cash flow and making sure that we can keep the commitments that we've made. That's going to happen on an ongoing basis. And we're going to have a comprehensive look at a 15-month cash flow, or through fiscal 2014, as soon as we can put that together. The 6-year contract, I was saying we could do in another couple of weeks. Enrique was saying maybe we don't need to do it in a couple of weeks. We could do it in a few months down the road, and we've got a lot more questions answered. But we're not talking about the.
Yes, I understand that. I'm not concerned about the 6-year contract at the moment. I'm
I
just
know.
concerned about this one.
Well, that's what he was talking
in the
about. Was this.
present context.
Right.
Yes,
And
I'm
so
glad.
long as it's clear in whatever motion we make today, that this is a commitment that's conditional on our ability to afford it as we go forward, and subject to suspension or postponement, then that sounds to me like an excellent way to proceed, without sacrificing unnecessarily the speed and the baseline data gathering that we need to do to have an effective study. But it seems to me that ought to be clear so that nobody's confused the nature of the commitment.
Okay.
I think that's clear.
Do you want to move?
Yes, I then move that the commission approve the budget as presented for the 15-month effort to start the research project for the amount of $3,459,391, with the understanding and subject to the ability of this commission to forecast the cash flows and the ability to pay for this effort, as well as with the ability of suspending at any point,
Some or all at any point, yeah.
some or all at any point.
Second?
Second.
I'll second that.
Okay. Any further discussion? We will call the roll. Commissioner Stebbins,
Yes.
Commissioner McHugh,
Yes.
Commissioner Zuniga,
Yes.
Commissioner Cameron.
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. I think we can call it a day. Anything else? Forgotten anything, anybody?
Don't simply happy birthday, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody, have a good
We have
weekend. Thank you
cake
very
here in
much.
Marlboro.
Thank you, Commissioners. Oh, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Seconded?
Second.
All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, Fall River and Marlboro.